Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where gods walk among mortals and entire worlds burn at the whim of beings beyond comprehension, there exists a pantheon of legends that tower above even the mightiest of heroes. These are the Primarchs, the Emperor's own sons, genetically crafted demigods who once led humanity's greatest armies across the stars. Their names echo through 10,000 years of history. Horus the War Master, Gilliman the Statesman, Lionel Johnson the Strategist, Sanguinius the Angel. Yet among these towering figures, one stands apart not for his conquest or his glory, but for something far more profound and far less celebrated. His name is Vulkan, the Lord of Drakes, and he may be the most underestimated Primarch to have ever walked the galaxy. When scholars of the Imperium recount the tales of the Primarchs, and they speak in reverent tones of battlefield genius and martial prowess, they chronicle the victories of Rogel Dawn, they analyze the tactics of Perturabo, they debate the psychic might of Magnus the Red. But Vulkan is often relegated to footnotes, remembered primarily as the one who survived, the craftsman among warriors, the humanitarian in an age that had no use for humanity. This perception could not be more tragically wrong, and it is a mistake that has cost the Imperium dearly over the millennia. You see, Vulkan possessed something that none of his brothers could claim, a combination of gifts that made him perhaps the most dangerous and certainly the most enduring of the Emperor's creations. He was a perpetual, blessed with true immortality, able to regenerate from wounds that would obliterate even other Primarchs. He was a master craftsman, whose creations rivaled the works of the ancient Mechanicum at its height. He commanded the absolute loyalty of one of the most dedicated Space Marine legions ever to serve the Imperium. And most importantly, he understood something fundamental that many of his brothers never grasped: that the purpose of all their strength, all their power, all their conquest was not glory or dominion, but the protection and elevation of humanity itself. This is not the story of the greatest warrior among the Primarchs, though Vulkan was formidable beyond measure. This is not the tale of the most brilliant strategist, though his tactical acumen was considerable. This is the chronicle of a being who embodied what the Emperor truly meant his Primarchs to be, a guardian and guide for humanity, whilst a beacon of hope in the eternal darkness. It is the story of how one Primarch's compassion was mistaken for weakness, how his patience was dismissed as passivity, and how his greatest strengths were overlooked by an Imperium that valued spectacle over substance. The tragedy of Vulkan is not that he failed. The tragedy is that so few recognized his success for what it truly was. While his brothers fought for personal glory or ideological purity, Vulkan fought for something infinitely more precious and infinitely more difficult to achieve. He fought to preserve the very humanity that the Imperium claimed to protect. He stood as a bulwark, not just against external enemies, but against the slow corruption of purpose that turned the Emperor's dream into a nightmare of oppression and endless war. And for this, our history has largely forgotten him, remembering only the flash and thunder of his more celebrated brothers, while the steady flame of Vulkan's legacy burns on, unnoticed and unappreciated. But to understand why Vulkan deserves recognition as perhaps the most important of all the Primarchs, we must journey back to the beginning, to a world of fire and ash, where an infant demigod fell from the stars and was raised not by kings or warriors, but by a simple blacksmith who taught him that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to create. The birth of a legend. Nocturne's Forge. The creation of the Primarchs remains one of the Emperor's most closely guarded secrets, a work of genetic alchemy so profound that even the greatest minds of the Mechanicum can scarcely comprehend its scope. In the depths of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the master of mankind worked for decades to craft 20 beings who would be more than human, more than space marines, more than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Each Primarch was designed with specific purpose, each one embodying certain aspects of the Emperor's own vast psyche and abilities. Some were given the gift of tactical brilliance, others the capacity for unwavering loyalty, still others the terrible charisma needed to command armies numbering in the millions. Vulkan was given something unique among his brothers. The Emperor, in his infinite foresight, or perhaps in some moment of unexpected compassion, crafted Vulkan as a perpetual, a being capable of true immortality through continuous cellular regeneration. This was a gift the Emperor himself possessed, and a trait so rare in the galaxy that it marked Vulkan as special even among his superhuman siblings. Yet this gift would remain unknown to Vulkan for most of his life, a secret ability that would only reveal itself in the most desperate of circumstances. The Emperor had created in Vulkan not just a warrior, but a being who could endure, who could outlast any trial, who could be killed 1,000 times and return 1,001. But the Emperor's grand plans were disrupted before they could reach fruition. The ruinous powers, those malevolent entities lurking in the warp, perceived the threat these Primarchs represented and acted with terrible swiftness. In a single catastrophic moment, they reached across the barrier between reality and the Imperium, tore the infant Primarchs from their cradles, and scattered them across the galaxy like seeds cast to the wind. Each Primarch fell to a different world, shaped by vastly different circumstances, molded by the cultures and challenges they encountered. This scattering was meant to be a curse, a way to ensure that the Emperor's greatest weapons would never serve their intended purpose. Instead, it became a crucible that tested and tempered each Primarch in unique ways. Vulkan's pod crashed through reality and materialized in the atmosphere of a world called Nocturne, a planet of such harsh extremes that it seemed designed to break anyone foolish enough to call it home. Nocturne existed in a deadly gravitational dance with its moon, Prometheus, a relationship that caused constant tectonic instability and volcanic activity across the planet's surface. While the world was perpetually racked by earthquakes and eruptions, its surface scarred by rivers of molten rock that carved new landscapes with every passing season. The sky itself would darken with ash clouds so thick that they could blot out the sun for months at a time, plunging entire regions into a darkness broken only by the crimson glow of lava flows. It was during one such period of upheaval, known to the people of Nocturne as the Time of Trial, that Vulkan's pod descended from the heavens. The Time of Trial was the most dangerous period in Nocturne's already perilous cycle, a season when the gravitational influence of Prometheus reached its peak, triggering catastrophic volcanic activity across the entire planet. Settlements were regularly destroyed, entire populations forced to flee as the very ground beneath their feet turned to liquid fire. It was a time of survival, of testing, when only the strongest and most adaptable could hope to endure. Into this crucible of fire and stone, an infant Primarch fell. The pod was discovered by a blacksmith named Bel, a craftsman of considerable skill who dwelt in the settlement of Hesiod, one of the larger communities in Nocturne's southern regions. Bel was a practical man, hardened by a life spent working metal in conditions that would break lesser artisans. When he found the strange pod and the child within, he did not question the miracle or seek to exploit it. Instead, he did what any decent person would do. He took the child in and raised him as his own son, naming him Vulkan after the first king of the salamanders, the great fire-resistant reptiles that were among the few creatures capable of thriving in Nocturne's brutal environment. From the moment of his discovery, it was clear that this was no ordinary child. Within 3 years, the boy who would become known as Vulkan had grown to surpass every adult in Hesiod in both size and strength. His mind developed with equal rapidity, absorbing knowledge and techniques with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Under Bel's patient tutelage, young Vulkan learned the art of the forge, and he took to it with a passion and aptitude that left even his adoptive father in awe. By his 4th year on Nocturne, Vulkan was not simply matching the blacksmithing skills of the settlement's masters. He was surpassing them. developing techniques and methods that had never been seen before on the planet. But Vulkan's growth was not limited to physical prowess or technical skill. Enbel, for all his rough exterior, was a man of principle and compassion, qualities that were particularly valuable in the harsh world of Nocturne, where such virtues could mean the difference between a community's survival and its destruction. He taught Vulkan that strength without purpose was meaningless, that the ability to create was far more valuable than the ability to destroy, and that the measure of a person lay not in what they could take, but in what they could give. These lessons would shape Vulkan's character in ways that would echo through 10,000 years of history, setting him apart from many of his brothers, who were raised by warrior kings and conquerors. But the people of Nocturne lived under a constant threat that made their volcanic world seem almost welcoming by comparison. The Dark Elder, those twisted remnants of a fallen civilization who dwelt in the nightmare city of Komorra, had long ago identified Nocturne as a prime hunting ground. The planet's isolation and the relative primitiveness of its people made it an ideal target for slave raids. The Dark Elder would descend from the void without warning, their sleek ships cutting through Nocturne's ash-choked skies, and they would fall upon the settlements with a cruelty that defied comprehension. They took victims not just for labor, but for sport, and for darker purposes still, dragging screaming captives back to their dark city, where fates awaited them that were worse than any death Nocturne's volcanoes could provide. The people of Hesiod, like settlements across Nocturne, had developed a grim protocol for these raids. Each person had their own hiding place, carefully prepared and maintained, where they would conceal themselves when the Dark Eldar came. It was a survival strategy, born of bitter experience and terrible necessity. Better to hide like prey and survive than to stand and fight creatures whose technology and malice far exceeded anything Nocturne's people could hope to counter. For generations, this had been the way of things. The Dark Eldar would come. They would take what they wanted from those unfortunate enough to be caught, and then they would depart, leaving the survivors to rebuild and wait for the next raid. When Vulkan was in his 4th year on Nocturne, the Dark Elder came again to Hesiod. But this time, something was different. As the people fled to their hiding places, and the familiar sounds of the raiders' weapons began to echo through the settlement's streets, one figure did not run. In the center of the settlement, a young giant stood with 2 massive smithing hammers crossed over his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the sky where the Dark Eldar ships descended. Vulkan refused to hide. More than that, he refused to accept that hiding was the only option. The sight of this defiant figure, standing alone while death descended from above, stirred something in the hearts of Hesiod's people. Perhaps it was shame at cowering while a youth stood firm. Perhaps it was inspiration kindled by Vulkan's fearless stance. Perhaps it was simply the recognition that if this young giant was willing to stand and fight, then maybe, just maybe, they could too. Whatever the reason, the people of Hesiod emerged from their hiding places. Armed with whatever tools and weapons they could find, they joined Vulkan in the settlement's center and prepared to defend their home. What followed was a battle that would become legend on Nocturne. The Dark Eldar, accustomed to finding only cowering victims, instead encountered organized resistance, led by a being whose strength and speed shocked even these ancient warriors. Vulkan fought like a force of nature, his hammers rising and falling with devastating effect, each blow crushing armor and shattering weapons that had been forged in the dark foundries of Komorra. He moved through the battlefield with a deadly purpose, protecting the people of Hesiod even as he struck down their tormentors. The Dark Eldar, for all their cruel sophistication and millennia of experience, found themselves outmatched by a combination of Vulkan's superhuman abilities and the desperate courage of ordinary people fighting for their homes and loved ones. By the time the battle ended, over 100 Dark Eldar lay dead, their bodies scattered across Hesiod's streets. Vulkan himself had accounted for a significant portion of these casualties, his hammers having painted the settlement stones with the blood of tormentors who had preyed on Nocturne's people for generations. But more importantly than the count of the slain was what the victory represented. For the first time in living memory, the people of a Nocturnian settlement had stood and fought, and they had won. The Dark Eldar ships limped back into the void, and the survivors knew that something fundamental had changed. On news of the victory at Hesiod spread across Nocturne like wildfire through dry grass. Within weeks, representatives from the 7 largest settlements on the planet had made the journey to meet this young giant who had shown them that resistance was possible. These were the leaders of Nocturne's most powerful communities, hardened survivors who had seen countless raids and endured innumerable hardships. They came to Hesiod, bearing both curiosity and hope, wondering if what they had heard could possibly be true. When they met Vulkan and heard the account of the battle directly from those who had fought in it, they made a collective vow that would transform Nocturnian society. Never again would they hide from the raiders. Never again would they surrender their people to slavery, and worse, without a fight. Vulkan's leadership and example had fundamentally altered the culture of an entire world. Where once there had been resignation and passive survival, now there was determination and active resistance. The settlements of Nocturne began to coordinate their defenses, to share intelligence about raid patterns, to train their people in combat alongside their traditional crafts. Vulkan himself became a central figure in these efforts, traveling between settlements to help organize their defenses and to teach them the techniques that had proven effective against the Dark Eldar. His reputation grew with each passing month, and the people began to speak of him not just as a defender, but as something more, a hero sent to lift Nocturne from the darkness of perpetual victimhood. It was in this context, with Vulkan's legend spreading across the planet and the 7 great settlements united in their newfound resolve, that the leaders of Nocturne's communities decided to hold a grand tournament. This competition would serve multiple purposes. It would celebrate their victory over the Dark Eldar. It would showcase the new spirit of strength and unity that Vulkan had inspired. And it would demonstrate to any potential raiders that Nocturne was no longer easy prey. The tournament would include contests of every kind, tests of strength and endurance, demonstrations of craftsmanship and skill, challenges that would push even the mightiest warriors and artisans to their limits. The tournament preparations consumed Nocturne for months. Arenas were constructed, challenges designed, prizes gathered, but representatives from every major settlement confirmed their participation, each one eager to prove the worth of their warriors and craftsmen. The event would be the largest gathering in Nocturne's history, a celebration that would unite the fractured communities of the volcanic world in common purpose. And at the center of it all stood Vulkan, the undisputed champion, whose participation would give the entire affair its legitimacy and significance. No one doubted that Vulkan would emerge victorious from whatever challenges the tournament presented. After all, who on Nocturne could possibly match the strength of the youth who had single-handedly turned the tide against the Dark Eldar? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. For as the people of Nocturne prepared their celebration, forces far beyond their world were already in motion. Yes, the Emperor of Mankind had spent decades searching for his scattered sons, using every tool at his disposal to locate the Primarchs and restore them to their rightful place at his side. His search had led him across the galaxy, and now it had brought him to Nocturne. But the Emperor understood that simply appearing and claiming his son would not suffice. Each Primarch needed to choose to serve, needed to understand through their own experience why the Emperor's vision was worthy of their allegiance. And so the Master of Mankind prepared to test his son in the most appropriate way possible, through a contest that would reveal the true measure of both their characters. The Tournament of Champions. The day of the tournament arrived with all the pageantry and excitement that Nocturne's people could muster. The settlement of Hesiod had been transformed for the occasion, temporary structures erected to house the thousands who had made the journey from across the planet. Banners bearing the symbols of the 7 great settlements flew from every prominent building, their colors bright against the perpetually ash-darkened sky. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, though whether this was from the excitement of the gathered crowds or the ever-present volcanic activity was impossible to say. This was to be more than a simple athletic competition. It was a celebration of Nocturne's new spirit, a demonstration that the people of this harsh world would no longer accept victimhood as their destiny. The opening ceremonies had barely concluded when something unexpected occurred. A stranger appeared at the edge of the gathering, and seeming to materialize from the crowds as if he had been there all along, though no one could recall seeing him arrive. Everything about this newcomer marked him as an outsider to Nocturne. His skin was pale, almost luminescent compared to the dark, ash-tempered complexions of the Nocturnians who had spent their lives under volcanic skies. His clothing was unlike anything seen on Nocturne, crafted from materials that seemed too fine, too perfect, to have been made by local artisans. There was an aura about him that was difficult to define, a sense of presence that made even the boldest warriors feel small by comparison. The stranger walked directly to the tournament grounds with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the assembled crowds despite its measured tone. Yet he made a simple request. He wished to be allowed to compete in the tournament. The crowd's initial response was a mixture of confusion and amusement. To come to Nocturne's greatest celebration as an unknown outsider and request entry into the competition seemed either incredibly brave or profoundly foolish. But then the stranger made a declaration that turned amusement into outright laughter. He claimed he could best anyone present in any contest that might be devised. The arrogance of this statement seemed breathtaking. Everyone present knew that Vulkan would be competing, and Vulkan had already proven himself beyond any doubt the greatest warrior and craftsman Nocturne had ever known. The idea that this pale stranger with his outlandish clothes could match, let alone exceed, Vulkan's abilities struck most observers as absurd. But Vulkan himself, standing among the tournament organizers, did not laugh. He studied the stranger with an intensity that suggested he saw something in this peculiar visitor that others missed. When Vulkan stepped forward to acknowledge the stranger's challenge, the crowd fell silent. Vulkan proposed terms that elevated the competition from a simple contest to something far more significant. Both he and the stranger would compete, and whoever lost the tournament would swear eternal loyalty and obedience to the victor. It was a dramatic wager, one that carried implications far beyond the immediate competition. For Vulkan to offer such terms suggested that he recognized in this stranger someone worthy of such a binding oath. The stranger accepted without hesitation, but his expression revealing nothing of what he might be thinking or planning. The tournament, that had been conceived as a celebration of Nocturnian strength and unity, had suddenly become something else entirely. A test that would determine the future not just of Vulkan, but potentially of the entire planet. The contests that followed were unlike anything Nocturne had ever witnessed. Event after event, challenge after challenge. Vulkan and the stranger matched each other with a precision that seemed almost impossible. In feats of strength, they proved equal. When both competitors were asked to hold massive anvils above their heads, they stood locked in place for half a day before the judges finally declared the contest a draw, neither showing any sign of fatigue despite the impossible weight they bore. In tests of endurance, they pushed each other to limits that would have killed ordinary men, yet both continued without complaint or surrender. The crowds watched in amazement as these two beings demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal human capability. The craftsmanship contests proved equally matched. Both Vulkan and the stranger demonstrated mastery of the forge that left Nocturne's best artisans shaking their heads in disbelief. They created works of such precision and beauty that they seemed to belong to some higher order of craftsmanship entirely. Tools that appeared simple upon first glance revealed themselves to be marvels of engineering when examined closely. Weapons forged in mere hours showed a quality that normally required months of careful work. Each creation was a masterpiece, and each masterpiece was perfectly matched by the other competitor's work. The judges found themselves unable to declare a clear victor in any of the craftsmanship events, as both participants had achieved what seemed to be the pinnacle of what was possible. 8 days passed in this manner, with contest after contest ending in draws or victories so narrow that they might as well have been ties. The initial amusement of the crowds had long since transformed into something approaching religious awe. They were witnessing something beyond their previous understanding of what was possible, watching two beings who seemed to operate on a level that normal humans could scarcely comprehend. The stranger never faltered, never showed frustration at his inability to decisively defeat Vulkan. And Vulkan, for his part, seemed to be enjoying himself in a way that transcended simple competitive spirit. There was something almost joyful in how he approached each new challenge, as if the opportunity to test himself against a true equal was a gift he had not realized he had been missing. As the 8th day drew to a close, with Vulkan and the stranger still perfectly matched in their accumulated scores, the tournament organizers devised one final challenge. This would be a test that combined elements of craftsmanship, strength, and hunting skill, the 3 areas where Vulkan had proven himself most exceptional. Both competitors would be given exactly 24 hours to craft a weapon of their own design, using whatever materials they could find and whatever techniques they knew. Once their weapons were completed, they would use these newly forged implements to hunt the most dangerous prey Nocturne had to offer, a fully grown salamander, one of the great fire-breathing reptiles that gave the planet's dominant life form its name. The competitor who returned with the largest specimen would be declared the overall victor of the tournament. Vulkan and the stranger accepted these terms and immediately set about their respective tasks. Vulkan withdrew to the forge he had built in Hesiod, while the stranger requested access to raw materials and a workspace, both of which were swiftly provided. For 24 hours, the sounds of hammering and the glow of forge fires filled the air as both competitors labored on their weapons. The people of Hesiod attempted to catch glimpses of what Vulkan was creating, but he worked behind closed doors, focused entirely on his task. The stranger similarly worked in isolation, allowing no observers to witness his process. When the allotted time expired, and both competitors emerged with their completed weapons, the crowd gasped. Vulkan bore a massive warhammer, its head forged from some of Nocturne's hardest volcanic stone and bound with metal worked to such perfection that it seemed to glow with an inner light. Every line of the weapon spoke to its purpose. This was an implement designed to deliver devastating force with absolute precision. The stranger's weapon was similarly impressive, though crafted in a different style, reflecting techniques and aesthetic principles that seemed foreign to Nocturnian craftsmanship, yet were clearly masterful in their execution. The hunt itself became the stuff of legend on Nocturne, but both Vulkan and the stranger set out into the volcanic wastes that surrounded Hesiod, each seeking the largest salamander they could find. These creatures were among the deadliest predators on Nocturne, massive reptiles whose bodies had evolved to thrive in the planet's volcanic environment. They could exhale gouts of superheated air that could melt stone. Their scales were harder than any armor Nocturne's smiths could produce, and they possessed a cunning that made them far more dangerous than simple beasts. To hunt one was considered a supreme test of courage and skill. To specifically seek out the largest specimen was borderline suicidal. Vulkan tracked his prey into the Pyre Desert, a region of Nocturne where volcanic activity was so intense that the ground itself seemed to burn. The heat in this area was so extreme that most humans would have died within minutes of exposure, but Vulkan moved through it as though it were merely uncomfortable rather than lethal. He found what he was looking for, a salamander of truly massive proportions, easily the largest specimen he had ever seen. The creature's scales gleamed with reflected heat, and its eyes tracked Vulkan's approach with an intelligence that was almost disturbing. The battle between Vulkan and the salamander was epic in its scope. The creature's breath weapon turned the ground around them into pools of molten rock, but Vulkan's speed and strength allowed him to avoid the worst of the attacks while closing the distance. His hammer struck again and again, each blow carefully calculated to weaken the creature, without unnecessarily prolonging its suffering. As even in the heat of combat, Vulkan's compassion showed through. He did not seek to torment the salamander, only to prove himself its superior and claim it as his prize. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes of intense combat, Vulkan stood victorious over the fallen creature. But here is where the tale takes its crucial turn. As Vulkan prepared to transport his prize back to Hesiod, the method he had chosen to move the massive creature proved nearly fatal. He had devised a system of ropes and leverage, intending to use the salamander's own weight to help haul it up and over the edge of a volcanic crevasse that separated him from the most direct path home. The plan was sound in theory, but in execution, something went wrong. The ropes shifted, the balance altered, and suddenly, Vulkan found himself hanging over a drop that led directly into a river of molten lava, clinging desperately to the ropes, while the dead weight of the salamander threatened to drag him down into the inferno below. For hours, Vulkan hung there, his superhuman strength the only thing keeping him from falling to what he believed would be his death. He had faced the Dark Eldar without flinching, had stood alone against impossible odds, had hunted the most dangerous prey on Nocturne. But now, hanging above that river of fire, he faced a different kind of challenge. This was not a test of strength alone, but of will, of the determination to hold on when every fiber of his being screamed for release. The heat rising from below was intense enough to have reduced a normal human to ash in seconds, but Vulkan endured. Yet his mind focused on a single goal: survival. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that the stranger appeared. He emerged from the volcanic landscape bearing his own prize, a salamander that was clearly larger than the one Vulkan had claimed. By all rights, the stranger had won the competition. He had completed his task more successfully than Vulkan, had proven himself the superior hunter. The terms of their wager were clear. Whoever returned with the larger specimen would be declared the victor, and the loser would swear eternal loyalty to the winner. The stranger had only to continue on his way back to Hesiod to claim his victory. But the stranger did not continue on his way. Instead, he assessed the situation with a single glance, understanding immediately the peril Vulkan faced. Without hesitation, the stranger did something that shocked Vulkan to his core. He lifted his own prize, the salamander he had spent 24 hours crafting a weapon to hunt and had risked his life to claim, and threw it into the river of lava. The massive corpse created a temporary bridge of cooling stone across a narrow section of the molten flow, and the stranger used this bridge to cross to where Vulkan hung suspended. With strength that matched Vulkan's own, the stranger seized the ropes and hauled the Primarch to safety, saving his life at the cost of his own victory. Together, the stranger and Vulkan made their way back to Hesiod, the stranger bearing no trophy to present to the judges. When they arrived at the tournament grounds, the outcome seemed clear. Vulkan had returned with his prize, while the stranger had come empty-handed. By the letter of the competition's rules, Vulkan was the victor. The judges prepared to declare him the winner and to accept the stranger's oath of loyalty as per the terms they had both agreed to at the tournament's beginning. But Vulkan surprised everyone present by doing something entirely unexpected. Rather than accepting the victory and claiming the stranger's oath of loyalty, Vulkan knelt before the pale outsider. The gesture stunned the assembled crowds into absolute silence. Vulkan, the hero of Nocturne, the being who had single-handedly transformed their world, was kneeling before a stranger who had just lost the tournament. When Vulkan spoke, his words carried a wisdom that transcended any victory he might have claimed.
You know, I've been studying Warhammer lore for quite a while, and every time I revisit Vulkan's story, I'm struck by something that bothers me deeply. We live in a hobby where everyone can recite Angron's gladiator backstory, where fans debate Gulliman's administrative genius for hours, where Sanguinius gets endless praise for his nobility, but Vulkan, he's treated like a footnote, a nice guy with a hammer who wasn't cool enough to matter. And that's exactly the problem the Imperium itself faced. They had a Primarch who actually understood what they were supposed to be fighting for, who saw civilians as people worth protecting rather than resources to be managed, and they dismissed him as soft. Meanwhile, they celebrated brothers like Kurzay and Angron, whose methods were fundamentally broken. It's like we learned nothing from the heresy itself. Vulkan wasn't weak for caring. He was strong enough to hold onto his humanity when literally everything was trying to strip it away. That's not soft. That's titanium grade resolve. And honestly, if more of his brothers had listened to him instead of dismissing his compassion as weakness, maybe half of them wouldn't have turned traitor. Just saying. But anyways, let's get back to this story.
He declared that any person who would value life over pride, who would sacrifice their own triumph to save another, was worthy of his service. The stranger's response was to help Vulkan rise and reveal his true identity. This was no mere wandering warrior or master craftsman come to test himself against Nocturne's champion. This was the Emperor of mankind, creator of the Primarchs, master of terror, the being who had forged Vulkan in his own genetic image and imbued him with purpose. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowds. The stranger who had appeared from nowhere was not just a powerful warrior, but a being of such cosmic significance that merely being in his presence should have been impossible for ordinary mortals. The Emperor explained to Vulkan who and what he was, revealed the truth of the Primarch's origins and his intended purpose. He spoke of the Great Crusade, yet the galaxy-spanning effort to unite all of humanity under a single banner and bring enlightenment and order to the chaos of old night. He described the role Vulkan was meant to play in this grand design, commanding one of the Space Marine legions and serving as one of the primary instruments of the Emperor's will. Everything Vulkan had been, everything he had accomplished on Nocturne, had been merely preparation for this greater calling. But the Emperor also made clear that the choice was Vulkan's to make. He had won Vulkan's loyalty not through the tournament's formal rules, but through his actions, through the demonstration that his values aligned with the principles Vulkan held most dear. The Emperor had shown through deed, rather than word, that he understood the difference between strength and power, that he valued life over pride, that he recognized the importance of compassion even in the midst of conflict. These were the very lessons Enbel had taught Vulkan, and seeing them embodied in the Emperor himself removed any doubt the Primarch might have had. Vulkan's acceptance of his role marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. He would leave Nocturne, though he would never truly abandon it. The world that had shaped him, the people who had fought beside him, the forge where Enbel had taught him the fundamental principles that would guide him through the millennia to come. These would remain part of him no matter how far he traveled. But now, he had a greater purpose to serve, a larger family to meet, and a destiny that would span the stars themselves. The Emperor had found his son, not through conquest or coercion, but through a test that revealed the true character of both participants. Vulkan had proven himself worthy not by demonstrating superior strength or skill, though he possessed both in abundance, but by recognizing that true victory lies not in defeating others, but in upholding the principles that make victory meaningful. It was a lesson that would shape everything Vulkan would do in the centuries to come, a foundation upon which he would build a legacy unlike any of his brothers. The master craftsman, more than a warrior. When the Emperor brought Vulkan into the fold of his grand project, the Primarch was not immediately thrust into command of his legion as some of his brothers had been. Instead, there was a period of years where Vulkan remained close to the Emperor, as working alongside him and learning the scope and scale of the Great Crusade. This apprenticeship, if such a term can be applied to the relationship between the Emperor and one of his sons, gave Vulkan unique insights into the Emperor's vision and methods. It also provided the Primarch with opportunities to develop his skills in ways that would set him apart from his siblings. During this time, Vulkan had access to the Emperor's own workshops and laboratories, spaces where technology and craftsmanship reached levels that seemed to blur the line between science and sorcery. The Emperor was, among his many other attributes, a craftsman of supreme ability. capable of creating wonders that even the most skilled tech priests of Mars could barely comprehend. Under such tutelage, Vulkan's already prodigious talents flourished and evolved. And he learned techniques that predated the age of strife, recovered lost knowledge that the Mechanicum believed forever beyond recovery, and developed his own innovations that combined ancient wisdom with novel approaches. The weapons and artifacts Vulkan created during this period would become legendary throughout the Imperium. Unlike the mass-produced war gear that equipped the vast armies of the Great Crusade, Vulkan's creations were each unique masterpieces, items crafted with such care and precision that they transcended their utilitarian purposes to become works of art. Every weapon he forged was perfectly balanced, every tool precisely calibrated, every armor piece fitted as though grown rather than constructed. But more than technical perfection, Vulkan's creations carried something else, a quality that was harder to define but impossible to miss. They felt right in a way that other, objectively similar items did not. They seemed to resonate with purpose, as though the act of crafting them had imbued them with a fraction of Vulkan's own dedication and will. His most famous creation from this period was the massive warhammer called Dawnbringer. This weapon represented the pinnacle of Vulkan's craftsmanship, a tool of war that could only be wielded by a Primarch, and one that seemed specifically designed to channel Vulkan's particular strengths. The hammer's head was forged from materials so dense and durable that it could shatter ceramite armor and crush plasteel bulkheads with equal ease. The haft was worked to perfection, its length and balance calculated with mathematical precision to maximize the force of each blow, while allowing for surprisingly quick recovery and repositioning. But the truly remarkable feature of Dawnbringer was its integrated teleportation device, a piece of archaeotech so sophisticated that even the Mechanicum's most learned adepts struggled to understand its principles. This teleporter was not simply a convenience, but a reflection of Vulkan's understanding that a weapon must serve multiple purposes to be truly valuable. It could allow him to traverse vast distances in an instant, arriving on battlefields where his presence was most needed. It could provide escape from situations that would be death traps for anyone else. And most importantly, it could ensure that even if Vulkan himself fell, as the weapon would not remain in enemy hands, as it was keyed specifically to him and would return to a predetermined location upon activation. In creating Dawnbringer, Vulkan had not simply forged a weapon, but had crafted a tool that embodied his entire approach to warfare, overwhelming force tempered by tactical flexibility and strategic foresight. But Vulkan did not create only for himself. He understood that his brothers, the other Primarchs, would face challenges that required specialized equipment beyond what even their legions could provide. So he set about crafting gifts for them, weapons and artifacts suited to their particular strengths and fighting styles. For Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the Iron Hands and one of Vulkan's closest friends among his brothers, Vulkan created a masterwork of directed energy technology. As the furnace's heart was a plasma pistol of Baroque design, each component crafted to tolerances that seemed impossible even for such advanced technology. It fired supercharged plasma shells that could annihilate heavily armored targets with single shots, the power of a sun's fury compressed into a weapon small enough to be wielded in one hand. The creation of these gifts revealed something important about Vulkan's character. He did not craft them to curry favor or to demonstrate his superiority. Instead, he created them because he genuinely wanted his brothers to have the best possible tools for the tasks they would face. Each gift was personalized, designed with the recipient's specific needs and preferences in mind. This was not mass production or standardized equipment, but bespoke craftsmanship driven by a desire to help those he considered family. The irony, of course, was that some of these magnificent gifts would eventually be turned against him and the Imperium he served, but at the time of their creation, they represented pure expressions of brotherhood and support. The philosophy behind Vulkan's craftsmanship went deeper than simple technical excellence. For him, the act of creation was fundamentally different from the act of destruction. Any fool with enough power could destroy, could break and burn and tear down what others had built. But to create something, to bring into existence something that had not existed before, required not just skill, but vision, not just strength, but patience. Every item he crafted, from the mightiest weapon to the simplest tool, was an act of defiance against the entropy and chaos that constantly threatened to consume the galaxy. In a universe that seemed determined to grind everything down into dust and darkness, creation was perhaps the most profound form of resistance. This understanding led Vulkan to build a vast personal vault, a repository where he stored thousands of weapons, tools, and artifacts he had created over the years. This collection represented decades of work, countless hours at the forge, the accumulated knowledge and skill of a being who operated at the very peak of what was possible in the fields of technology and craftsmanship. The vault contained everything from simple but perfectly made blades to machines of such complexity that they seemed almost alive. Some items were practical tools for war and conquest, such as weapons designed to help the legions prosecute the Great Crusade more effectively. Others were more esoteric, devices whose purposes were known only to Vulkan himself, perhaps experimental technologies or artistic expressions of theoretical principles. But the existence of this vast collection created a problem that Vulkan could not ignore. As the Great Crusade progressed and the Emperor's dream spread across the galaxy, the Primarch began to notice disturbing patterns. The conquest and enlightenment that the Crusade promised was increasingly being achieved through methods that troubled him. Entire worlds were being brought to compliance through terror and overwhelming force, when diplomacy might have achieved the same ends with far less bloodshed. The weapons he and others had created to protect humanity were being used with a casual brutality that seemed to miss the entire point of why they were fighting in the first place. The breaking point came when Horus, the War Master and the Emperor's most trusted son, fell to chaos. The betrayal of such an exalted figure sent shockwaves through the Imperium, but for Vulkan, it carried a particularly painful lesson. If even Horus, the best and brightest of all the Primarchs, could be corrupted, then nothing was safe from potential misuse. The weapons Vulkan had created with such care, the artifacts he had forged to help protect humanity, could just as easily be turned to its destruction if they fell into the wrong hands. His vault of treasures, intended as a legacy and a resource for future generations, had become a potential arsenal for the enemies of everything he held dear. Faced with this terrible realization, Vulkan made a decision that would have lasting consequences for millennia to come. He traveled to Prometheus, the moon of Nocturne, where his legion maintained its primary forge complex, and met with his forge master, Tekel. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Vulkan's life. He explained to Tekel that all of the artifacts in his vault, the accumulated work of a lifetime, would have to be destroyed. Every weapon, every tool, every piece of technology he had created with such painstaking care would have to be melted down and unmade. It was the only way to ensure that they could never be perverted to evil purposes, never be used against the very people they were meant to protect. Whilst Tekel was horrified by this proposal, to him, and to anyone who understood the true value of what Vulkan had created, the idea of destroying such treasures was almost sacrilegious. These artifacts represented more than just masterful craftsmanship. They were Vulkan's legacy, the physical embodiment of his genius and dedication. To destroy them would be to erase a significant part of what made Vulkan who he was. Tekel pleaded with his Primarch to reconsider, arguing that the potential for good these items represented far outweighed the risk of their misuse. Surely, he reasoned, if they could survive the coming conflict, these wonders could be used to help rebuild and strengthen the Imperium. Vulkan listened to his Forge Master's arguments with the patience that characterized all his interactions, but in the end, his mind was made up, and the risk was simply too great. However, moved by Tekel's passion and recognizing the wisdom in preserving at least some legacy for future generations, Vulkan offered a compromise. He would allow Tekel to select 7 artifacts from the vault, items that would be preserved and hidden across the galaxy rather than destroyed. These would serve as a test for future salamanders, a quest that would require dedication and skill to complete. If his gene sons could prove themselves worthy by finding these scattered treasures, then perhaps they would also have the wisdom to use them properly. The choice of which artifacts to preserve fell to Tekel, a responsibility that weighed heavily upon him. How could anyone decide which of Vulkan's creations deserved to survive and which should be consigned to the flames? In the end, Tekel selected items that represented different aspects of Vulkan's craft: the unbound flame, the obsidian chariot, the spear of Vulkan, the song of entropy, the chalice of fire, the eye of Vulkan, and the engine of woes. These 7 artifacts, along with 2 items that Vulkan retained for his own use, Dawnbringer and the Gauntlet of the Forge, became known as the 9 artifacts of Vulkan. They would be scattered and hidden, waiting for the salamanders of future ages to prove themselves worthy of wielding their creator's greatest works. As for the rest of the vast collection, Tekel was given the grim task of destruction. Within the massive furnaces of the Chalice of Fire, a forge ship so vast that it could maintain entire manufactorums within its hull, thousands of irreplaceable artifacts were methodically destroyed. As Tekel watched through reinforced viewing ports as weapons and tools that represented decades of work were melted down into component materials, their unique properties and perfect construction reduced to raw matter. He described the experience as a second loss of Vulkan, as though each artifact that entered those flames took with it a piece of the Primarch's soul. The decision to destroy his life's work was perhaps the clearest demonstration of Vulkan's fundamental wisdom. He understood that creation and destruction were not opposing forces, but parts of a larger cycle. Sometimes, to protect what mattered most, you had to be willing to sacrifice even the things you treasured. The weapons he had forged were magnificent, but they were still just tools. What truly mattered was not the objects themselves, but the knowledge and skill that had gone into making them, and more importantly, the purpose they had been created to serve. If that purpose could be better achieved by their destruction than by their preservation, then destruction was not a tragedy, but a necessity. This act of self-sacrifice, this willingness to destroy what he had built to protect what he loved, revealed the depth of Vulkan's commitment to humanity. His brothers might have balked at such a choice, might have found reasons to preserve their creations regardless of the risk. But Vulkan understood that true strength sometimes meant accepting loss, that wisdom sometimes required destruction, and that the greatest gift he could give to future generations was not a vault full of wonders, but the assurance that those wonders would never be used to harm them. In choosing to destroy rather than preserve, Vulkan demonstrated a level of selflessness and foresight that few of his brothers could match. Humanity's Shield, the Great Crusade. When Vulkan finally took command of his legion, the 18th, it marked the beginning of a partnership that would reshape both the Primarch and his gene-sons in profound ways. The legion had originally been known as the Dragon Warriors, a name that spoke to their ferocity and their origins in the Emperor's genetic laboratories. But upon being reunited with their Primarch and witnessing the tournament where he had proven himself to the Emperor, the legion was renamed the Salamanders in honor of the great reptiles of Nocturne and the contest that had first revealed Vulkan's true nature. It was more than a simple change of title. It represented a fundamental shift in the Legion's identity and purpose, a transformation from mere warriors into something more complex and more human. The reunion between Vulkan and his Legion occurred during one of the most desperate moments in their history. The Salamanders had been engaged in a brutal campaign against a massive greenskin horde, the kind of genocidal tide of violence that threatened to overwhelm even Space Marine forces. The Legion was on the brink of annihilation, outnumbered and surrounded, when Vulkan arrived at the head of a fleet carrying 3,000 newly trained Space Marines, all bearing his gene seed and ready to fight under his command. The timing of this reinforcement was nothing short of miraculous, and it turned what should have been a catastrophic defeat into a hard-won victory. From that moment forward, the Salamanders knew that their Primarch was not just their genetic progenitor, but their savior and their leader in the truest sense. Under Vulkan's leadership, the Salamanders began to develop a character that set them apart from other legions. Where many of the Emperor's Genesons led their forces with cold strategic calculation or burning ideological fervor, Vulkan brought something different to his legion. He instilled in them a profound respect for human life, an understanding that the purpose of their strength was not domination, but protection, not conquest, but guardianship. This philosophy was revolutionary in the context of the Great Crusade, where entire worlds were routinely subjected to brutal compliance actions that killed billions in the name of unity. The Salamanders, following their Primarch's example, became known for taking extraordinary measures to minimize civilian casualties during their campaigns. Where other legions might flatten entire cities to root out pockets of resistance, the Salamanders would send in precision strike teams, accepting greater risk to their own forces in order to protect innocent lives. Where others might employ weapons of mass destruction to achieve quick compliance, Vulkan's sons would engage in protracted ground campaigns, fighting room by room and building by building if necessary to avoid collateral damage. This approach did not make them weak or ineffective, far from it. The Salamanders were formidable warriors whose combat prowess was unquestioned, but their strength was tempered by compassion, their violence bounded by a moral framework that recognized the humanity of those they fought to protect. This philosophy brought Vulkan into conflict with some of his brother Primarchs, particularly those who viewed such concerns as weakness or inefficiency. One of the most significant of these conflicts occurred during the compliance action on the world designated 1546, locally known as Karatan. This campaign brought together the Salamanders, the Night Lords under Conrad Kersey, several Mechanicum Titan legions, and multiple Imperial army regiments. It should have been a straightforward operation, a combined force of such overwhelming power that resistance would be quickly and efficiently crushed. Instead, it became a demonstration of fundamentally incompatible approaches to warfare and a preview of the darkness that would eventually tear the Imperium apart. The Night Lords, under Kersey's command, approached the compliance of Karatan with their characteristic use of terror as a weapon. They did not simply defeat military resistance. They systematically annihilated entire population centers to spread fear among the remaining settlements. When Vulkan discovered that the Night Lords had massacred an entire city, killing every man, woman, and child within its walls, he was appalled. This was not warfare. It was genocide masquerading as strategy. The people of that city had been civilians, non-combatants who posed no military threat. Their death served no purpose beyond spreading terror, and even if terror could be justified as a tactic, the wholesale slaughter of innocents could not. Vulkan confronted Kersey directly, demanding an explanation for this atrocity. The exchange that followed revealed the vast gulf between their philosophies. Kersey argued that his methods were effective, that the massacre had caused resistance elsewhere on Karatan to collapse without further fighting. By killing thousands, he had potentially saved millions who would have died in a protracted campaign. The fear he generated was a weapon as valid as any bolter or blade, and the fact that it made others uncomfortable was irrelevant compared to its effectiveness. From Kersey's perspective, Vulkan's objections were naive, the squeamishness of someone who did not fully understand the brutal necessities of galactic conquest. But Vulkan saw it differently. To him, the purpose of the Great Crusade was not simply to conquer worlds and add them to the Imperium's territory. The goal was to unite humanity, to bring disparate populations into a single community where they could be protected and elevated. Terror might force compliance, but it could not create loyalty. Fear might stop resistance, but it could not build the foundations for a lasting peace. The massacre on Karatan had achieved tactical objectives at the cost of strategic failures. The people of that world would never truly be part of the Imperium now. They would be subjects held in check by terror, always waiting for an opportunity to rebel, always harboring hatred for the forces that had proven themselves monsters rather than saviors. The confrontation between Vulkan and Kersey nearly came to blows, as two Primarchs on the verge of turning their weapons on each other over fundamental disagreements about what they were trying to achieve. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, but the incident left a lasting mark on Vulkan. He reported Kersey's actions to Horus, who was by this time the War Master, hoping that the matter would be taken seriously and that limits would be placed on the Night Lord's methods. Instead, Horus responded with mockery and dismissal, thanking Vulkan for making Kersey into an even more effective weapon of terror. This response disturbed Vulkan deeply. It suggested that Horus, the Emperor's chosen champion, approved of Kersey's methods, or at least considered them acceptable in service of the Crusade's goals. It was this incident, more than any other, that prompted Vulkan's decision to potentially destroy his artifacts. As if Horus, the exemplar of what a Primarch should be, could embrace such darkness, then no one could be trusted with weapons of great power. The War Master's casual acceptance of atrocity as a tool of policy revealed a corruption that went beyond mere tactical disagreement. It suggested that the Crusade itself might be losing sight of its purpose, becoming an engine of conquest rather than an instrument of enlightenment. Vulkan could not change this trajectory alone, but he could ensure that his own creations would not contribute to it. Despite these conflicts and concerns, Vulkan continued to serve the Great Crusade with absolute dedication. The Salamanders fought across hundreds of worlds, and bringing them into compliance with the Imperium, while adhering to their Primarch's principles of minimal civilian casualties and respect for human life. They became known not just as fierce warriors, but as protectors, space marines who would stand between civilians and danger, even when doing so put them at greater risk. Stories spread of salamanders holding defensive lines to allow civilian evacuations, of Vulkan himself carrying wounded non-combatants from burning buildings, of an entire legion that seemed to remember that the people they fought for were individuals deserving of dignity and protection, not merely statistics or resources to be managed. This reputation was not universally admired within the ranks of the Space Marines. Some viewed the Salamander's concern for civilian casualties as a liability and a weakness that could be exploited by clever enemies. Others saw it as inefficient, a wasteful expenditure of effort that could be better directed toward achieving quick military victories. But Vulkan remained unmoved by such criticism. He understood something that many of his brothers did not, that a crusade won through terror and mass slaughter would ultimately fail in its purpose, even if it succeeded in its immediate objectives. You could not build a lasting civilization on a foundation of fear and corpses. The Imperium they were creating had to be worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth preserving. And that meant treating the people it was meant to protect as more than collateral damage in someone else's grand strategy. Vulkan's approach to warfare also shaped the internal culture of the Salamander's Legion. Unlike some legions where Space Marines viewed themselves as wholly separate from baseline humanity, existing in an elevated caste of warriors who had transcended normal human limitations and concerns, the Salamanders maintained close ties with civilian populations. When not actively campaigning, they would work alongside human craftsmen and laborers, sharing their knowledge and learning from the practical wisdom of people who worked with their hands. They maintained contact with their families when possible, understanding that remembering one's origins helped maintain perspective on what they were fighting for. This connection to humanity served another important purpose. It reminded the Salamanders that they were not gods or monsters, but humans who had been enhanced to serve humanity's protection. The gene modifications and indoctrination that created a Space Marine could sometimes erode one's ability to relate to normal humans, to remember what it was like to be vulnerable and mortal. By maintaining active engagement with civilian populations, by seeing the faces and hearing the voices of the people they protected, the Salamanders preserved something essential that other legions had lost. They remembered why they fought and for whom. Vulkan himself embodied this principle in everything he did. He did not sequester himself in command centers and strategy rooms, issuing orders from on high while others carried them out. When the Salamanders went to war, Vulkan fought beside them, often at the very front of the battle where the fighting was fiercest. He stood in the shield wall with his tactical squads, while wielded Dawnbringer to break enemy fortifications, and personally led rescues of trapped civilians, even when doing so, diverted resources from military objectives. His presence on the battlefield was not merely symbolic. It was a constant reminder to his legion that their Primarch shared their dangers and their duties, that he asked nothing of them that he was not willing to do himself. This hands-on approach to leadership also gave Vulkan insights that some of his more distant brothers lacked. He saw firsthand the cost of war, not just in military casualties, but in the suffering inflicted on civilian populations caught between opposing forces. He witnessed the desperation of refugees fleeing from advancing armies, the anguish of parents searching for lost children in the aftermath of battles, at the blank-eyed shock of survivors trying to rebuild lives shattered by conflicts they never asked to be part of. These experiences reinforced his conviction that their methods mattered as much as their objectives, that how they won was just as important as whether they won. The tragedy is that this wisdom, so hard-earned and so clearly demonstrated through the Salamander's successful campaigns, was largely ignored by the wider Imperium. Vulkan was respected as a capable military commander and valued for his craftsmanship, but his philosophy of compassionate warfare was dismissed as an idiosyncrasy, a personal preference that worked for the Salamanders but had no broader applicability. That the idea that an entire crusade could be fought with genuine concern for the welfare of those being liberated seemed naive to many of the Imperium's leaders, who were focused on achieving territorial objectives as quickly and efficiently as possible. This dismissal of Vulkan's methods would have terrible consequences when the heresy came. The Imperium had spent decades training its forces to value victory over everything else, to see civilian casualties as acceptable costs, to prioritize efficiency over ethics. When half the legions turned traitor, they found an Imperium that had already normalized the very brutality and callousness that would characterize Chaos's approach to warfare. The difference between loyalist and traitor became increasingly blurred as both sides employed tactics of terror and mass destruction. Vulkan's alternative, the possibility of a crusade built on protection rather than domination, was swept aside by the urgency of survival and the momentum of institutional practice. But even in this failure, there was a kind of success. The Salamanders, shaped by their Primarch's principles, remained steadfastly loyal when the heresy came. They did not waver or question their allegiance because they knew with absolute certainty what they were fighting for. While other legions might have been swayed by Horus's rhetoric about the Emperor's failures or by Lorgar's theological arguments, the Salamanders had a clarity of purpose that transcended such concerns. They fought for humanity in the most literal and direct sense possible. That commitment, forged in the fires of countless campaigns where they had put themselves at risk to protect civilians, would be tested to its absolute limit on the killing fields of Ishtvan V Betrayal's Flames, Ishtvan V. The betrayal at Ishtvan V stands as one of the darkest moments in Imperial history, a watershed that separated the hopeful era of the Great Crusade from the nightmare of the Horus heresy. When word reached Terra that Horus had turned traitor, that 4 entire legions had rebelled against the Emperor and had committed atrocities on Ishtvan III that beggared comprehension, the response was swift and decisive. Rogel Dawn, acting under the Emperor's authority, assembled a retribution fleet consisting of 7 full Space Marine legions. 3 would form the first wave, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulkan, and the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax. 4 more legions would provide reinforcement: the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Alpha Legion. What the Loyalists did not know, what they could not have known until it was far too late, was that the 4 reserve legions had already pledged themselves to Horus. The betrayal at Ishtvan V was not a battle that went wrong. It was a meticulously planned massacre designed to cripple the Loyalist forces before they could mount an effective resistance to Horus's rebellion. The War Master had turned the Emperor's own strategic acumen against him, using the appearance of overwhelming force to lure 3 loyal legions into a kill zone where they would be surrounded and destroyed. It was a trap of such cruel perfection that it would become legendary. Up the drop site massacre that would echo through 10,000 years of history. The approach to Istvan V revealed the first hints that something was wrong. The Loyalist reconnaissance found that Horus's forces were concentrated in and around the Urgol Depression, a vast canyon surrounded by treacherous terrain and heavily fortified defensive positions. The traitors had transformed the area into a fortress, bristling with weapons emplacements and protected by void shields so powerful that orbital bombardment was effectively useless. Any assault would have to be made on the ground, with forces deploying directly into prepared killing fields. It was a defensive position of such strength that even 3 full legions would be hard-pressed to break it. Ferrus Manus, driven by rage at Fulgrim's betrayal and burning with the need for vengeance, pushed for an immediate assault. Vulkan and Korax both urged caution, recommending that they wait for the reserve legions to arrive before committing to such a dangerous attack. The defensive positions were too strong, the enemy too well prepared. To attack with only 3 legions against an enemy of unknown strength, dug into fortifications of this quality, risked exactly the kind of grinding attrition that would negate their numerical advantage. Better to wait a few more days, to allow the 4 reserve legions to join them and launch a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the traitors through sheer force of numbers. But Ferrus would not be swayed. His rage at Fulgrim's treachery had consumed him, overriding the tactical brilliance that had made him one of the most successful commanders of the Great Crusade. And he argued that delay would only allow Horus to further strengthen his positions, that the traitors might escape if given enough time to prepare withdrawal routes, that the Emperor demanded swift justice for the atrocities committed on Istvan III. None of these arguments made tactical sense, and both Vulkan and Korax recognized them for what they were: rationalizations born of anger rather than strategy. But Ferrus was the senior Primarch among them, and ultimately they deferred to his authority despite their misgivings. The deployment itself was a marvel of coordinated military action. Hundreds of drop pods descended from the Loyalist fleet in carefully orchestrated waves, each one carrying Space Marines whose training and dedication made them among the deadliest warriors the galaxy had ever known. But the Iron Hands struck at the center of the traitor lines, Ferrus personally leading a formation of over 10 full companies of Morlocks, his elite Terminators whose armor and weapons made them living tanks. Vulkan led the Salamanders against the left flank, while Korax and the Raven Guard hit the right. The plan was simple and brutal. They would strike the traitor positions simultaneously from 3 directions, preventing Horus from concentrating his forces against any single assault, and forcing him to either defend everywhere or retreat. The initial assault went better than anyone had dared hope. The Loyalists, driven by righteous fury and supported by the element of surprise that came from attacking faster than the traitors had expected, carved through the outer defensive lines with devastating effectiveness. As Vulkan himself was in the thick of the fighting, Dawnbringer rising and falling in terrible arcs that shattered enemy positions and crushed any traitor foolish enough to stand against him. The Salamanders fought with the controlled fury that their Primarch had instilled in them, each squad supporting the others, each warrior aware of the civilians who might still be trapped in this war zone, and taking care, even in the midst of battle, not to cause unnecessary collateral damage. For hours, it seemed like the assault might succeed. The Iron Hands pushed deep into the traitor positions, with Ferrus personally dueling Fulgrim in a combat of such savage intensity that it seemed to warp reality around them. The Salamanders methodically cleared enemy strongpoints, their flamers and melter guns reducing fortifications to slag, while their bolters and blades dealt with any traitors who survived the initial onslaught. The Raven Guard, using their characteristic stealth and speed, struck at command posts and communication centers, seeking to blind and confuse the enemy leadership. Against 3 legions fighting in perfect coordination, even Horus's well-prepared defenses seemed inadequate. Then the reinforcements arrived, and the trap was sprung. The 4 reserve legions descended from orbit in drop pods and landing craft, their arrival heralded by Vox transmissions declaring their support for the Loyalist assault. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard battered from hours of intense combat and taking casualties despite their initial successes, fell back toward the positions where their reinforcements were landing, seeking to regroup and consolidate their forces for a final push against the traitors. It seemed like the tide of battle was about to turn decisively in favor of the Loyalists. With 7 legions now present on the battlefield, Horus's forces would be overwhelmed through sheer weight of numbers. Instead, the newly arrived legions opened fire on the Loyalists. The shock of that moment cannot be overstated. These were Space Marines, genetically engineered warriors who had fought side by side through countless campaigns, brothers in arms united by common purpose and shared loyalty to the Emperor. To have them turn their weapons on fellow Loyalists, to massacre Astartes, who were falling back toward what they believed were friendly positions, was a betrayal so profound that many of those killed literally could not comprehend what was happening until the very instant of their deaths. The Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion had timed their assault perfectly, catching the Loyalist forces at their most vulnerable moment when they were scattered and exhausted from the initial assault. The battlefield descended into absolute chaos. What had been a coordinated military operation became a desperate fight for survival. The Loyalist forces found themselves caught between Horus's original forces advancing from the Urgal Depression and the traitor reinforcements attacking from what should have been safe positions. Caught in this killing ground, subject to fire from multiple directions, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard died in thousands. Even the incredible skill and toughness of Space Marines could not save them from this concentration of firepower. The very coordination and efficiency that had made them so effective now worked against them, as the traitors used their knowledge of Loyalist tactics to predict and counter every defensive maneuver. Vulkan fought like a man possessed, Dawnbringer reaping a terrible toll among the traitors, even as his legion died around him. He tried to reach Ferris, to coordinate some kind of organized withdrawal, but the press of battle separated them. The Salamanders formed defensive positions wherever possible, creating small islands of resistance in the sea of betrayal, holding long enough for wounded battle brothers to be evacuated before falling back to new positions. But even Vulkan's tactical genius and the Salamander's discipline could not change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and being systematically slaughtered by enemies who knew their every strength and weakness. The breaking point came when Vulkan witnessed Ferrus Manus fall. Even at a distance, even through the chaos of battle, there was no mistaking what happened. Fulgrim, Ferris's closest friend turned arch-traitor, struck down the Gorgon and took his head as a trophy. The sight of a Primarch's death, of Ferris's decapitation and the desecration of his corpse sent shockwaves through the Loyalist forces. If a Primarch could be killed, if even these demigods were vulnerable, then what hope did ordinary Space Marines have? The Iron Hands, seeing their father slain, fought with suicidal fury, throwing themselves at the enemy in desperate attempts at vengeance that only hastened their own destruction. Vulkan knew that the battle was lost. No amount of courage or skill could overcome the tactical situation they faced. To remain on the battlefield was to die, and while Vulkan himself might survive through his perpetual nature, unknown to him at the time, his legion would be annihilated. The Salamanders needed to survive, needed to regroup and fight another day, needed to escape this killing ground so that they could continue to serve the Imperium. With a heavy heart, Vulkan ordered a general retreat, commanding any Salamanders who could disengage to fall back toward the original landing zones and attempt to reach orbit. But the traitors had anticipated this as well. The Iron Warriors, his masters of siege warfare and systematic destruction, had already moved to destroy the Loyalist landing craft and cut off their escape routes. The orbital battle had turned as well, with the traitor fleet engaging and destroying many of the Loyalist ships. Those Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Raven Guard, who managed to reach their evacuation points, found their transport destroyed or under such heavy fire that approach was suicidal. They were trapped on the surface of Istvan V with nowhere to run and enemies closing in from every direction. It was during this desperate retreat that Vulkan's incredible resilience was first truly tested. The Iron Warriors, seeking to ensure no loyalist forces escaped the massacre, called down a massive orbital bombardment on the retreating salamanders. Nuclear weapons and plasma warheads descended in a rain of atomic fire, turning entire sections of the battlefield into scorched wastelands where nothing could survive. Vulkan was caught in one of these strikes, a direct hit from a weapon powerful enough to vaporize entire city blocks. The explosion consumed him completely, and for long moments there was nothing where Vulkan had stood but a crater of fused glass and radioactive ash. But Vulkan did not die. His perpetual nature, that gift from the Emperor that he had never known he possessed, activated in response to this total destruction. At the cellular level, his body began to regenerate, pulling matter and energy from the surrounding environment in defiance of every known law of biology and physics. Atoms reassembled, tissues reformed, bones knit themselves together from constituent elements. It was not instantaneous. The process took time and required resources that left the surrounding area drained and cold. But eventually, impossibly, Vulkan lived again, pulling himself from the crater that should have been his tomb. The resurrection left him disoriented and weak in ways he had never experienced. The nuclear strike had not just destroyed his body, but had scattered his consciousness across the boundary between life and death, forcing him to claw his way back to awareness through sheer force of will. When he finally regained full consciousness, the battle around him had changed. The main fighting had moved on, the surviving loyalists either dead, captured, or scattered into the wastes of Istvan Vulkan, found himself alone in a landscape of ash and death, as surrounded by the bodies of his sons and brothers. He tried to rise, tried to continue the fight, but his body was still recovering from injuries that would have been instantly fatal to anyone else. Before he could fully regain his strength, the enemy found him. Hundreds of Night Lords and Iron Warriors descended on his position, their sensors having detected the energy signature of his regeneration. Vulkan fought with every ounce of strength he could muster, wielding Dawnbringer against impossible odds, refusing to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. He killed dozens before they finally brought him down, overwhelming him through sheer numbers and coordinating their attacks to strike from every angle simultaneously. The final blow came not from a blade or a bolter, but from a concentrated barrage that shattered his armor and broke his body. Vulkan felt consciousness slipping away, felt the darkness rising to claim him. But instead of death or another resurrection, he felt hands seizing him, dragging him away from the battlefield. His last sight before unconsciousness claimed him was the skull-faced helm of Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, leaning over him with an expression that might have been satisfaction or something darker still. When next Vulkan woke, he would find himself in chains aboard Kurz's flagship, about to experience torments that would make the Dropsite massacre seem like a mercy by comparison. But even in this moment of utter defeat, even as he was dragged into captivity, Vulkan's legacy lived on. The salamanders who survived the massacre, though reduced to a mere fraction of their original strength, carried with them their Primarch's teachings and his example. They had seen him fight to the last, had witnessed his refusal to abandon his principles even in the face of overwhelming betrayal. That memory would sustain them through the dark years ahead, a reminder that true strength lay not in victory, but in the courage to stand for what was right, regardless of the cost. The Dropsite massacre was a catastrophic defeat for the Loyalist forces, reducing 3 full legions to shattered remnants and demonstrating the full extent of Horus's treachery. But it also revealed something important about Vulkan and his legion. In their darkest hour, when everything they had built was being torn away, they had remained true to themselves. But the salamanders did not abandon their principles in the name of survival, did not embrace the same brutality as their enemies in hopes of gaining some advantage. They fought with honor and courage, protecting each other and any civilians who might have been caught in the chaos, holding to Vulkan's teachings, even as those teachings seemed to offer no path to victory. This steadfast adherence to principle in the face of ultimate crisis would define the Salamanders for the next 10,000 years. They would rebuild, slowly and painfully, but they would do so while maintaining the values their Primarch had instilled. And though the wider Imperium might forget or ignore Vulkan's wisdom, his gene sons would carry it forward as a sacred trust, a flame that no darkness could fully extinguish. The drop site massacre had been intended to break them, but it had instead forged them into something harder and more enduring than even the traitors could have anticipated. The Immortals' curse, torture, and rebirth. If the drop site massacre had been Vulkan's introduction to the brutality that his brothers were capable of unleashing, his captivity aboard Conrad Kurtz's flagship Nightfall became his education in the depths of depravity to which a Primarch could sink. Kurtz had captured Vulkan not out of strategic necessity or even simple cruelty, though the Night Haunter was certainly capable of both. Rather, he had taken his brother captive because he saw in Vulkan's compassion and humanity the very qualities he most despised, the weaknesses that he believed would inevitably lead to failure and death. And Kurtz intended to prove through systematic torture that Vulkan's principles were nothing more than delusions, that beneath the surface all Primarchs were killers who merely differed in their willingness to acknowledge that truth. The prison where Kurtz kept Vulkan was a masterwork of psychological and physical torment. It was not a simple cell, but rather a labyrinth of connected chambers, each one designed to inflict a different form of suffering. The walls themselves seemed to shift and change, creating the impression that escape was always just beyond reach, when in reality there was no escape at all. The lighting was carefully controlled to maximize disorientation, sometimes plunging Vulkan into absolute darkness for days at a time, other times assaulting him with blinding illumination that made rest impossible. Temperature, as atmosphere, even gravity were manipulated to keep the captive Primarch constantly off balance and unable to adapt to his environment. But these environmental tortures were merely the prelude to Kurtz's true purpose. The Night Haunter visited his captive brother regularly, sometimes in person, sometimes through holographic projection, always with new torments to inflict. He would lecture Vulkan on the futility of compassion, explaining in meticulous detail how every act of mercy Vulkan had ever shown had ultimately led to more suffering than if he had simply killed those he sought to save. He would force Vulkan to watch as captured Imperial Army soldiers, and even some surviving salamanders, were subjected to horrific tortures, daring the Primarch to prove his compassion by choosing which victims would be spared and which would suffer, at knowing that any choice would weigh on Vulkan's conscience. When these psychological attacks failed to break Vulkan's spirit, Kurtz turned to more direct methods. He subjected his brother to physical tortures that would have killed any normal human 1,000 times over, testing the limits of Primarch physiology with the methodical curiosity of a scientist conducting experiments. He learned quickly that conventional tortures, no matter how severe, had limited effectiveness against a being whose body could heal from almost any injury. So Kurtz adapted, developing new methods specifically designed to maximize suffering while preventing death or permanent damage. He became a virtuoso of pain, conducting a symphony of agony with Vulkan as his unwilling instrument. Through all of this, Vulkan endured. Yet he refused to give Kurtz the satisfaction of breaking, refused to abandon the principles that had guided him since Inbel first taught him the value of creation over destruction. Even as his body was subjected to unimaginable torments, even as his mind was assaulted by the screams of those he could not save, Vulkan maintained his conviction that compassion was not weakness, but the truest form of strength. He would not become what Kurtz wanted him to be, would not accept that all Primarchs were fundamentally the same monsters wearing different masks. And then Kurtz killed him. The method scarcely mattered, whether it was incineration or dismemberment or any of the dozens of other ways the Night Haunter found to end his brother's life. What mattered was that Vulkan died, truly and completely. His consciousness extinguished, and his body rendered into component parts. Kersey watched with satisfaction as his brother's life signs flatlined, as the great Primarch of the salamanders was reduced to a corpse. Finally, the Night Haunter believed. He had proven his point. Compassion had not saved Vulkan. Humanity had not protected him. In the end, he had died just as Kersey had always known he would. Except Vulkan did not stay dead. The resurrection began at the cellular level, a process so profound that it seemed to violate every known law of biology and physics. Dead tissue reanimated, severed connections reformed, destroyed organs rebuilt themselves atom by atom. It took time, longer than Kersey had patience to observe, so he left the corpse where it fell and departed to attend to other matters. When he returned hours or days later, was expecting to find only a rapidly decaying body, he instead discovered Vulkan alive and whole, sitting in the cell as though nothing had happened. Kersey's initial response was shock, quickly transforming into a species of delight that was perhaps more disturbing than his anger would have been. He had not simply captured a Primarch, he had acquired an immortal toy, a plaything that could be broken again and again without fear of permanently damaging it. The torture that had been intended to prove a philosophical point became instead an obsession, a compulsion to test the limits of Vulkan's regeneration and to find if there was any death so complete that even a perpetual could not return from it. What followed was a descent into a nightmare that beggared description. Kersey killed Vulkan in every way his twisted imagination could devise, in each death carefully documented and analyzed. He burned him, crushed him, poisoned him, drowned him in acid, exposed him to hard vacuum, subjected him to genetic dissolution, and inflicted 100 other fates that should have been final. Each time, after a period of hours or days, Vulkan returned. The process was not instantaneous resurrection in the same location as Kersey might have hoped. Instead, Vulkan's body would be moved to a different cell in the labyrinth while he was dead, so that upon awakening, he found himself in yet another chamber of torment, disoriented and confused, forced to start the cycle of suffering anew. The psychological toll of this repeated death and resurrection was immense. Each time Vulkan died, he experienced the full horror of his own annihilation, the terror of consciousness fading into nothingness, the existential dread of non-existence. And each time he returned, he had to reconcile the memory of that death with the reality of his continued existence, had to process the trauma of dying while simultaneously dealing with whatever new torture Kersey had prepared. The line between life and death began to blur, and Vulkan found himself increasingly unable to determine whether he was alive or dead, whether his current experience was reality or some fevered hallucination conjured by a dying brain. Kersey, for his part, began to understand that he had discovered something far more significant than simple immortality. Vulkan's perpetual nature was not just a physical phenomenon, but seemed to involve some deeper metaphysical process that pulled the Primarch back from death regardless of how completely he was destroyed. The Night Haunter became almost obsessed with understanding this ability, seeing in it potential confirmation of his own dark philosophy. If death could be overcome, if the ultimate consequence could be negated through sheer will and genetic engineering, then what did that say about the nature of mortality and the value of life itself? But even as Kersey tortured Vulkan's body, he was inadvertently demonstrating the very thing he sought to disprove. Despite experiencing death hundreds of times, despite being subjected to agonies that would have driven lesser beings to madness, Vulkan refused to break. He would not embrace Kersey's nihilism, would not accept that life was meaningless or that compassion was a weakness. Each resurrection became a defiant act, as a refusal to let Kersey's philosophy triumph even when the Night Haunter could control every other aspect of Vulkan's existence. The Salamander's Primarch had discovered a form of resistance that even death could not silence. He would endure, and in enduring, he would deny Kersey the validation his twisted soul craved. The torture continued for months, perhaps even longer, time itself becoming meaningless in the eternal cycle of death and resurrection. Vulkan lost track of how many times he had died, how many different torments he had endured. The cells began to blend together in his memory, each new awakening bringing with it a moment of confusion as he tried to determine which death this was, which torture chamber he currently occupied. His sense of self began to fragment under the relentless assault. Pieces of his identity scattered across countless deaths and rebirths. Yet through it all, one constant remained: his determination to prove Kersey wrong. Even when he could no longer remember why he was being tortured, even when the pain became so familiar that it seemed like the natural state of existence, Vulkan held on to one fundamental truth. He was not a monster. He would not become what the Night Haunter wanted him to be. And as long as he could hold on to that conviction, as long as some part of him remembered Enbel and Nocturne and the lessons he had learned about the value of creation and protection, then Kersey had not truly won. The breaking point came during one of Kersey's more elaborate tortures. The Night Haunter had constructed a massive war machine, an engine of destruction that could be controlled remotely, and he had imprisoned Vulkan within it, forcing the Primarch to pilot the machine while Kersey provided it with targeting data. The targets were captured Imperial Army soldiers and Raven Guard Space Marines, survivors from the drop site massacre, who had been taken prisoner. Kersey's intention was clear. He would force Vulkan to kill his own allies, to demonstrate that when given the choice between his own survival and the lives of others, even the compassionate Primarch would choose himself. But Vulkan found a third option. Rather than kill the prisoners, rather than submit to Kersey's will, he turned the machine's weapons on itself and on himself. The self-inflicted destruction was catastrophic, annihilating both the war machine and Vulkan in a massive explosion that should have killed the prisoners as well. But Vulkan had calculated the blast carefully, had positioned the machine to shield the captives from the worst of the detonation. They survived, traumatized but alive, while Vulkan died yet again, his body reduced to scattered atoms by weapons designed to destroy fortifications. When Vulkan awakened from this death, he found himself in yet another cell. But this time, something was different. Standing in the chamber with him was Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, accompanied by a team of elite Raven Guard warriors who had somehow infiltrated Kersey's flagship. Corax had come to rescue his brother, though the sight that greeted him was horrifying. Vulkan was barely coherent, his mind shattered by countless deaths and rebirths, his body bearing the scars of tortures that should have been impossible to survive. But he was alive, and that was enough. The escape that followed was harrowing, a running battle through the corridors of the Nightfall as Kersey's Night Lords pursued the fleeing loyalists. Vulkan fought alongside Corax and the Raven Guard, but his movements were mechanical, his responses delayed, as though he were operating on pure instinct, while his conscious mind remained trapped in the nightmare of his captivity. They fought their way toward a docking bay, where the Raven Guard had hidden a transport vessel, pursued every step of the way by Night Lords who seemed to materialize from every shadow. But even as they neared their goal, Kersey himself appeared, blocking their path to freedom. The Night Haunter stood alone against Corax and Vulkan, confident in his ability to defeat both of them, or at least to delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. What followed was one of the few times in recorded history when two Primarchs fought together against a third. Corax, with his speed and precision, struck from unexpected angles, while Vulkan, driven by months of accumulated rage and pain, attacked with overwhelming force. The Night Haunter was formidable, his precognitive abilities allowing him to anticipate their attacks and counter with devastating effect. But even his dark gifts could not overcome two determined Primarchs, fighting in perfect coordination. The duel reached its climax when Vulkan managed to seize Kersey and force him to the ground. Dawnbringer rose above the Night Haunter's head, poised to deliver a killing blow that would end one of the most dangerous traitors and avenge months of torture and suffering. Kersey looked up at his brother, and instead of fear or defiance, his expression was one of almost desperate hope. He wanted Vulkan to kill him, wanted to die at the hands of a brother he had spent so long trying to break. It would have vindicated everything Kersey believed about the inevitability of violence, would have proven that even the compassionate Vulkan could be reduced to a killer when sufficiently motivated. And in that moment, Vulkan understood the trap. If he killed Kurz, he would be proving the Night Haunter's philosophy correct, would be demonstrating that compassion and humanity were mere veneers covering an inherently violent nature. If Kersey wanted to die because his death at Vulkan's hands would have meaning, would serve as proof that the universe operated according to the dark principles he espoused. To kill him would be to give him exactly what he desired, to let him win even in death. So Vulkan lowered his hammer. The decision not to kill Kersey, to spare the brother who had tortured him for months and subjected him to indescribable agonies, was perhaps the most difficult choice Vulkan had ever made. Every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance, for an ending to the nightmare that Kersey represented. But Vulkan recognized that true strength lay not in the ability to kill, but in the wisdom to know when killing served no purpose beyond satisfying one's own rage. He would not give Kersey the satisfaction of proving him right. He would not become the monster that months of torture had been designed to create. Instead, Vulkan activated Dawnbringer's teleportation device, using it to escape the confrontation entirely. The hammer's built-in technology, which Kurz had believed he had disabled through psychic interference and technological damping fields, still functioned when powered by Vulkan's desperate will. In an instant, Vulkan vanished from the nightfall, teleporting across vast distances to rematerialize high in the atmosphere of an unknown world. The transition was violent and imprecise. The distance traveled far, exceeding what the device had been designed to handle, and the effort required every last bit of energy Vulkan could muster. As Vulkan plummeted toward the planet below, his body began to burn from the friction of atmospheric entry. The fall that should have taken him to safety instead became yet another death, perhaps the most drawn out and agonizing yet. He burned like a falling star, his flesh charring and peeling away, his body consuming itself in the heat of re-entry. By the time he impacted the surface, there was nothing left but a skeleton wrapped in the tattered remnants of his armor, a smoldering corpse that crashed into the ground with enough force to create a crater visible from orbit. This death was different from the others, more complete, more final in some fundamental way. The planet where Vulkan had fallen, as it happened, was Macragge, homeworld of Reboot Guilliman and the Ultramarines, but the Primarch's remains landed far from any settlement or outpost where they might be discovered. The skeleton lay in its crater, exposed to the elements. But as days turned to weeks, the regeneration process, normally reliable if slow, seemed to have stalled entirely. Perhaps the completeness of the destruction had exceeded even a perpetual's ability to recover. Perhaps the psychological trauma of months of torture and repeated death had finally broken something essential in Vulkan's spirit. Whatever the reason, the Lord of Drakes appeared to be truly and finally dead, his quest to escape Kersey and return to the Imperium ending in failure in an unmarked grave on a world that did not even know he had fallen there. But perpetuals, as it turned out, were remarkably difficult to kill permanently. The process was slower than before, requiring resources and time that previous resurrections had not needed. But eventually Vulkan began to heal, atom by atom, molecule by molecule. Yet his body rebuilt itself from the skeleton that had crashed to Macragge's surface. It was not a smooth or painless process. There were false starts, tissue that began to form, only to collapse back into constituent elements, organs that reconstructed themselves incorrectly and had to be unmade and reformed. But eventually, impossibly, Vulkan lived again. When he finally awoke, weeks or perhaps even months after his fall, he found himself whole but profoundly changed. The torture had left marks that went deeper than physical scars, had carved wounds into his psyche that would never fully heal. But he had survived, had endured the worst that Kurz could inflict, and had emerged on the other side still himself. He had not broken, had not become the monster that months of systematic cruelty had been designed to create. And in that survival, But in that refusal to surrender his humanity despite everything he had endured, Vulkan had won a victory far more significant than any he might have achieved through violence. The next chapter of his journey would take him through the webway, through the dark city of Komarach, through confrontations with the Cabal and struggles with his own fragmented psyche. But the foundations of that journey, the core of identity that allowed him to navigate those trials, had been forged in the torture chambers of the Nightfall. Vulkan had died hundreds of times and had returned hundreds of times, and each resurrection had been an act of defiance against Kurz's nihilism. He was a perpetual, yes, but more than that. He was a being who had chosen to hold on to his principles even when doing so brought only suffering. And that choice, repeated again and again through countless deaths, had transformed him from simply a powerful warrior into something far more rare and valuable, a symbol of hope that no darkness could fully extinguish. The long road home, journey through darkness, rising from his unmarked grave on Macragge, Vulkan found himself facing a challenge almost as daunting as his captivity aboard the Nightfall. He was alone on a world that, while loyal to the Emperor, was far from terror, and even farther from any concentration of Salamander's forces that might have survived the Dropsite massacre. His armor was damaged, his weapons lost, save for the hammer Dawnbringer which had teleported with him. Most concerning of all, his mind bore the scars of months of torture and repeated death, memories fragmented and confused, as reality itself seeming uncertain and unstable. The journey home would not simply be a matter of distance to travel, but of sanity to recover and purpose to rediscover. The first challenge was to restore his sense of self, to reassemble the pieces of identity that Kurz's torture had scattered. Vulkan found himself experiencing flashbacks and hallucinations, moments where he could not distinguish between memory and present reality, between the torture chambers of the Nightfall and the verdant forests of Macragge. He would be walking through peaceful countryside and suddenly find himself back in Kurz's prison, the smell of burning flesh and sound of screams overwhelming his senses until he forced himself back to awareness of his true surroundings. These episodes were terrifying, not just because of the memories they contained, but because they revealed how thoroughly his captivity had damaged his psyche. But Vulkan had one advantage that Kurzi had never anticipated: the very compassion and humanity that the Night Haunter had sought to destroy became the tools of Vulkan's recovery. As he made his way across Macragge, avoiding populated areas while he worked to regain his mental equilibrium, Vulkan began to interact with the planet's wildlife and environment. He crafted simple tools from stone and wood, created small fires to warm himself and cook the food he hunted, built temporary shelters that protected him from Macragge's weather. These acts of creation, these applications of the skills and Bell had taught him so long ago on Nocturne, served as anchors to his identity. Each tool he made, each fire he kindled, each shelter he constructed reminded him of who he was beneath the trauma and pain. Slowly, carefully, like a craftsman repairing a shattered blade, Vulkan pieced his mind back together. He drew on memories of Nocturne, of Nibel's patient teachings, and the warmth of the forge. He recalled the faces of his salamanders, the way they had fought with discipline and courage at Istvan V, even as their world collapsed around them. He thought of the civilians he had protected across 100 worlds, the lives saved and communities preserved through his legion's efforts. These memories, these reminders of purpose and meaning, became the foundation on which he rebuilt his shattered psyche. Eventually, after weeks of isolation and recovery, Vulkan felt strong enough to make contact with the wider world. But he approached one of Macragge's outlying settlements, a community of farmers and craftsmen who lived far from the planet's capital and military installations. The people there, simple folk living simple lives, had no idea who this massive, scarred warrior might be. They simply saw someone in need and offered what hospitality they could, providing food and shelter without asking for anything in return. This basic human decency, this willingness to help a stranger, served as a powerful affirmation of everything Vulkan had fought to preserve during his captivity. Kersey had tried to prove that humanity was fundamentally selfish and cruel. But these farmers, these ordinary people with no particular reason to be kind, demonstrated the opposite through their actions. While recovering in this settlement, Vulkan learned of the wider war that was consuming the galaxy. News had reached even this remote corner of Macragge about the Horus heresy, about how half the legions had turned traitor, and were even now marching on Terra itself. The people spoke of these events with fear and confusion, unable to comprehend how the Emperor's own sons could have betrayed him. Vulkan listened to these discussions and realized that his personal suffering, however terrible it had been, was only a small part of a much larger catastrophe. The Imperium itself was tearing apart, and he needed to be part of the effort to preserve it. But getting to Terra from Macragge presented significant challenges. The warp storms that had been growing in intensity since the heresy began made conventional travel increasingly dangerous. Even if Vulkan could have secured passage on a ship, the routes to Terra were likely blocked or controlled by traitor forces. He needed another way, a path that would bypass the conventional channels of travel and allow him to reach the Imperial Palace before the siege that he knew must be coming. The solution presented itself in the form of agents from the Cabal, a mysterious organization of Xenos who claimed to be working to prevent chaos from consuming the galaxy entirely. These beings had been manipulating events throughout the heresy, operating according to some grand design that saw the war as both catastrophe and opportunity. They revealed to Vulkan the existence of the Webway, the ancient Eldar network of tunnels that connected disparate points across the galaxy without requiring travel through the warp. If Vulkan could access the Webway, he could travel to Terra far faster and more safely than any conventional route would allow. But the Webway was not designed for human use, let alone for a being of Vulkan's size and nature. The portals were hidden and protected, their locations known only to the Eldar and a few other beings who had managed to discover their secrets. Moreover, the Webway itself was not safe. It was home to numerous dangers, from the Dark Eldar, who used it for their raids, to the various creatures and phenomena that dwelt in its depths. For Vulkan to attempt this journey alone, damaged and still recovering from his ordeal, seemed suicidal. Yet he had no better option. The Cabal's agents, for reasons of their own that Vulkan neither understood nor fully trusted, provided him with coordinates to a Webway portal on Macragge and basic information about how to activate it. They warned him that the journey would be perilous, that he would face challenges that might test him even more severely than Kersey's torture. But they also suggested that if he could survive the Webway and reach Terra, his presence might tip the balance in the coming struggle. The Emperor needed his sons, needed every ally he could gather for the battle that would determine the fate of humanity itself. Vulkan accepted these warnings and this guidance, though he remained wary of the Cabal's true motivations. He made his way to the coordinates they had provided and found the portal, a shimmering distortion in reality that seemed to exist partially in multiple dimensions at once. Taking a deep breath and steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, Vulkan stepped through. The Webway proved to be everything the Cabal had warned, and more. The tunnels were not designed for beings of Vulkan's scale, and his passage through them required constant effort to avoid becoming trapped or lost in side passages that branched off in directions that seemed to violate normal geometry. The environment itself was hostile in ways that were difficult to describe, with gravity fluctuating unpredictably and time seeming to flow at different rates in different locations. What should have been a journey of days or weeks became an odyssey of indeterminate length, as Vulkan navigated through a labyrinth that seemed specifically designed to confuse and disorient anyone foolish enough to enter it. Worse still were the inhabitants. The Webway was home to various factions of Eldar, but not the craft world-dwelling varieties who occasionally cooperated with the Imperium. Instead, Vulkan found himself in territories controlled by the Dark Eldar, those sadistic pirates who had once raided Nocturne, and whom he had first fought when he was barely more than a youth. The Dark Eldar recognized a Primarch when they saw one, and they saw in Vulkan an opportunity for profit and sport. They attacked in force, seeking to capture or kill this lone warrior who had dared to invade their domain. The battles that followed were brutal and desperate. Vulkan fought with Dawnbringer against enemies who wielded technology that seemed like sorcery, weapons that could flay flesh from bone with blasts of dark energy, poisons that could kill with the merest scratch. And the Dark Eldar were faster than him, more agile, able to strike from unexpected angles and retreat before he could retaliate. But Vulkan had advantages of his own. His perpetual nature meant that wounds that would have been fatal merely slowed him down, and his strength allowed him to shatter their armor and weapons when he could close to melee range. Moreover, he had learned patience during his captivity, had discovered that survival sometimes required enduring rather than attacking. One particularly harrowing engagement saw Vulkan fighting through a section of the webway that opened into Komorok itself, the Dark City where the Dark Eldar made their home. This nightmare realm, built from stolen architecture and sustained by suffering, represented perhaps the most concentrated evil in the galaxy outside of the Eye of Terror itself. The city sprawled across impossible distances, towers that reached toward a sunless sky, arenas where captives were forced to fight for the entertainment of crowds who fed on their anguish. Vulkan moved through the outskirts of this hellscape like a ghost, avoiding direct confrontation when possible, but striking with overwhelming force when stealth failed. Every moment spent in Komorok felt like an eternity, the oppressive atmosphere of concentrated malice threatening to crush even his indomitable will. But eventually, after what felt like months of travel through the webway, though the distorted time made precise measurement impossible, Vulkan emerged from the tunnels onto a world he recognized. He had reached the outskirts of the Sol system, within striking distance of Terra itself. What the journey had cost him dearly in both physical and mental terms, but he had survived. He had traversed one of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy and had emerged on the other side with his purpose intact. The torture of the Nightfall, the confusion of his resurrection on Makrag, the horrors of the webway, all of these trials had failed to break him or turn him from his path. Yet even now, so close to his goal, Vulkan faced one final test before he could rejoin the war. He was accompanied by a small group of salamanders who had survived the drop site massacre and had been searching for their Primarch, warriors who had found him during his journey and pledged themselves to his protection. These loyal sons had helped him navigate the final stretches of the webway. Had fought beside him against the Dark Eldar, and worse things that dwelt in those ancient tunnels. They had proven their dedication beyond any question, and Vulkan valued them as both warriors and as connections to the Legion he had thought lost. But as they prepared to make the final approach to Terra, they encountered agents of the Cabal once more. These Xenos conspirators revealed that they possessed a weapon, a device known as the Fulgurite, which had the power to permanently kill even a perpetual. This artifact, they claimed, had been created specifically to end the Emperor's life should it become necessary, but it could also be used against any perpetual, including Vulkan himself. The Cabal's agents, operating according to their own inscrutable agenda, believed that Vulkan's presence on Terra would upset their carefully laid plans. They had decided that the Primarch needed to die, truly and finally, before he could interfere with whatever outcome they were trying to achieve. What followed was a confrontation that brought Vulkan face to face with his own mortality in a way that even Kurz's torture had not. The Fulgurite was wielded by a being who called himself a perpetual like Vulkan, a human named John Grammaticus, who had lived for thousands of years and who claimed to be acting in humanity's best interests. The weapon struck Vulkan with terrible force, its power specifically designed to disrupt the cellular regeneration that allowed perpetuals to return from death. For the first time since his awakening on Nocturne, Vulkan felt true death approaching, not the temporary cessation that Kurzi had inflicted hundreds of times, but the final ending from which there would be no resurrection. His salamanders, seeing their Primarch struck down, reacted with fury and desperation. They fought against impossible odds to protect Vulkan's body, refusing to abandon their father even when doing so meant their own certain deaths. Their loyalty and sacrifice, their willingness to die, rather than let their Primarch be desecrated, served as a powerful reminder to Vulkan of what he was fighting for. These were not simply soldiers following orders, but sons protecting their father, brothers standing together against darkness. Their actions embodied everything he had tried to teach them about the value of loyalty and the strength found in unity. But the Fulgurite's power was not absolute, and Vulkan's will to survive proved stronger than the weapon's design parameters. Through sheer determination and the fundamental nature of his perpetual gift, Vulkan began to recover even from this supposedly permanent death. The process was agonizing and incomplete, leaving him weakened in ways that normal deaths had not. But he lived. When he finally rose, it was to find that his salamanders had driven off the Cabal's agents at terrible cost. Many had fallen, their gene seed lost, their names to be added to the rolls of honor alongside all the other salamanders who had died in service to the Imperium. The grief Vulkan felt at these losses was profound, but it was tempered by pride in what his sons had accomplished. They had faced beings whose technology and power far exceeded anything the Imperium could field, and they had prevailed through courage and determination. Yet they had proven that the principles he had instilled in them were not mere philosophy, but practical tools for survival, that loyalty and brotherhood could overcome seemingly impossible odds. And they had done all of this, not for glory or reward, but simply because it was right, because they would not abandon their Primarch, regardless of the cost. With the Cabal's immediate threat neutralized and his strength gradually returning, Vulkan finally completed his journey to Terra. He arrived at the Imperial Palace during the final stages of preparation for the siege that everyone knew was coming. Horus's forces were advancing toward the Sol system, bringing with them 7 entire traitor legions and uncounted numbers of corrupted Imperial army regiments. The defenses of Terra were formidable, but the attackers would outnumber them significantly, and the traitors had the advantage of initiative and momentum. The coming battle would be the largest and most significant of the entire heresy, a clash that would determine whether the Emperor's dream survived or was crushed beneath the weight of his son's betrayal. Vulkan's arrival, though he was but one Primarch accompanied by a handful of surviving salamanders, was greeted with relief and hope by the defenders. Every additional warrior was valuable, but a Primarch represented far more than simply another combatant. Vulkan brought with him strategic knowledge, combat experience, and most importantly, the living proof that even the worst defeats of the heresy were not necessarily final. He had survived the drop site massacre, had endured torture that would have broken any normal being, had traversed the webway, and emerged on Terra ready to fight. If he could survive all that, perhaps the Imperium itself could survive the siege to come. But Vulkan's most significant contribution to the defense of Terra would not be his presence on the walls or his prowess in combat, though both would prove valuable. Instead, it was his role in a secret project that the Emperor himself had been developing, a contingency plan so terrible in its implications that only a being like Vulkan, who understood both the value of life and the necessity of sacrifice, could be trusted to oversee it. The Emperor summoned his son to the throne room and revealed the truth of what he had been building in secret while the galaxy burned around them. Yet Doomsday's guardian, the siege of Terra, the weapon that the Emperor revealed to Vulkan was called the Talisman of 7 Hammers, and it represented perhaps the darkest aspect of the master of mankind's strategic thinking. This device, forged by the Emperor's own hand with assistance from Vulkan's unwitting contributions, was designed to serve as a dead man's switch for Terra itself. Should Horus succeed in his assault, should the traitors breach the walls of the Imperial Palace and threaten to claim the throne room, the talisman could be activated. Its activation would trigger a chain reaction that would consume all of Terra in a cataclysmic explosion, denying the planet and everything on it to the forces of chaos. Better to destroy humanity's birth world than to let it fall into the hands of the ruinous powers. Better to render Terra a lifeless rock than to allow it to become a demon world from which chaos could spread across the galaxy unchecked. The horror of this revelation struck Vulkan with physical force. The Emperor was asking him, the Primarch who valued life above all else, to be the one who would potentially destroy billions of lives in a single moment. Terra was home to more humans than any other world in the galaxy, its population numbering in the uncounted billions. To activate the talisman would be to commit genocide on a scale that made even the worst atrocities of the heresy seem small by comparison. Every principle Vulkan had ever held, every lesson in Bel had taught him about the value of creation over destruction, rebelled against the very concept of such a weapon. But the Emperor's logic was inexorable. If Terra fell to chaos, those billions would suffer fates far worse than simple death. They would be enslaved, corrupted, transformed into things that bore no resemblance to humanity. Their souls would be fed to demons, their bodies mutated into weapons of chaos, their minds broken and reshaped to serve the dark gods. The mercy of a quick death, even on such a massive scale, was preferable to the eternal torment that would follow Terra's fall. Moreover, Terra's capture would give chaos a foothold in real space that might prove impossible to dislodge. From a corrupted Terra, the traitors could spread their influence to every remaining Imperial world, could use the symbolic power of humanity's birth world to demoralize and break any remaining resistance. The Emperor explained that he had designed the talisman specifically to require Vulkan's involvement because the Primarch possessed the unique combination of qualities necessary for such a terrible responsibility. Vulkan was strong enough to survive whatever battles might rage around him, ensuring that the talisman would be protected and available when needed. He was compassionate enough to understand the full weight of what activating the device would mean, ensuring that it would never be triggered lightly or for insufficient cause. And most importantly, he was hesitant to use the weapons he forged, a quality that the Emperor saw not as weakness, but as wisdom. Of all his sons, Vulkan was the one most likely to exhaust every other option before resorting to this ultimate measure. The Emperor revealed another truth to Vulkan. The Primarch's journey through the webway, his resurrection on Makrage, even his creation of certain artifacts, had all been part of a larger design. The Emperor had been guiding Vulkan's path, using his psychic influence to ensure that his son would be in position to fulfill this role when the time came. The Warhammer Draculae, which Vulkan had forged while in a semi-conscious state, influenced by the Emperor's will, was a key component of the talisman. The torture aboard the Nightfall, as terrible as it had been, had served to harden Vulkan's resolve and demonstrate his ability to endure impossible suffering without breaking. Every trial, every torment, every loss had been preparation for this moment, for this choice that would define the rest of Vulkan's existence. And Vulkan was appalled by these revelations. To learn that his suffering had been part of some grand design, that the Emperor had watched him endure Kurz's torture without intervention because it served a larger purpose, challenged his faith in ways that even the betrayal at Istvan V had not. But he could not deny the logic of the Emperor's argument, could not refute the necessity of having some final option if all else failed. The talisman was an abomination, a weapon that violated everything Vulkan believed in, but it was also, potentially, the only thing that could prevent an even greater catastrophe. So Vulkan accepted the burden. He would be the guardian of the talisman, the one who would activate it if and when the time came. He would carry the weight of billions of potential deaths and would live with the knowledge that he might be required to commit the greatest act of destruction in human history. It was perhaps the cruelest task the Emperor could have assigned to any of his sons, and he had chosen the one Primarch for whom it would be most agonizing. But Vulkan understood that this was precisely why he had been chosen. If someone who valued life as highly as he did could bring himself to activate the talisman, then the situation would truly be desperate enough to warrant such an extreme measure. As the siege began in earnest, with Horus's forces descending on Terra like a plague of darkness, Vulkan took up his position deep within the Imperial Palace. He was stationed in the throne room itself, close to where the Emperor would sit upon the golden throne to power the Astronomicon and coordinate Terra's defenses. Yeah, the talisman was hidden nearby, its location known only to Vulkan, the Emperor, and a handful of the most trusted defenders. Should the traitors breach the final walls, should Horus himself stand before the throne with victory within his grasp, Vulkan would activate the device and deny him that victory through the ultimate sacrifice. The siege that followed was a nightmare of biblical proportions. The traitor forces, corrupted by chaos and driven by demonic fury, threw themselves at Terra's defenses with suicidal abandon. The outer defenses fell despite the best efforts of the defenders. Orbital platforms were destroyed or captured. Entire sections of the planet's surface were reduced to ash and ruin. The fighting ground on for weeks, then months, an endless cycle of assault and defense that consumed millions of lives on both sides. As the defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that they were not simply defending a planet, but the very future of humanity itself. Vulkan, confined to his position in the throne room by the necessity of guarding the talisman, could only wait and listen to reports of the battles raging across Terra. He heard of the heroic last stands and terrible defeats, of entire regiments annihilated to buy minutes of time, of Space Marines dying in their thousands to hold positions that were ultimately overrun. Each report brought him closer to the moment when he might have to activate the talisman, each loss making that terrible choice seem more inevitable. The traitors advanced relentlessly, pushing past the outer walls, breaching the inner defenses, finally reaching the Imperial Palace itself. The fighting in the palace's corridors and chambers was some of the most intense of the entire siege, with every room contested, every hallway fought over meter by meter. Loyalist Space Marines from multiple chapters made their stands in the palace's halls, buying time with their lives for evacuation of critical personnel and relics. The traitor Primarchs led their legions personally, seeking to break through to the throne room and claim ultimate victory. And through it all, Vulkan waited in the throne room with his hand, metaphorically, on the trigger of the talisman. He watched as Malkador, the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, took the Emperor's place upon the golden throne so that the master of mankind could go forth to confront Horus directly. He listened to the sounds of battle drawing ever closer, the explosions and screams and sounds of ceramite impacting ceramite as Space Marines clashed in the palace's outer chambers. He knew that if the Emperor fell, if Horus stood triumphant, the responsibility to activate the talisman would fall to him. The moment of ultimate crisis came when communications from the Emperor ceased. The throne room's defenders, already battered from holding against continuous assaults, began to despair. If the Emperor had fallen, if Horus had won their duel, then all was lost. The traitors would break through the final defenses within hours at most, and then chaos would have terror. Vulkan stood before the talisman, his hand trembling as he prepared to activate it. Billions of lives hung in the balance. The entire future of humanity rested on a choice he was about to make. But then, a message reached the throne room, broadcast by a source Vulkan did not immediately recognize. It was the voice of Acti, a former handmaiden to the Emperor, someone who had served him before the heresy, and who had fled Terra during the siege's early stages. She was transmitting from somewhere on the surface of Terra, and her message was simple but profound. The Emperor still lived. He was still fighting. The battle was not yet lost. The hope that Vulkan had been about to extinguish, the future he had prepared to destroy, still had a chance. Vulkan stepped back from the talisman, his hand falling away from its activation mechanism. He would wait, would trust that the Emperor could prevail, would not condemn billions to death while hope remained. The decision not to activate the talisman, as coming as it did at the very last moment when activation seemed inevitable, was perhaps the most difficult choice Vulkan had ever made. To carry the burden of that weapon, to stand ready to use it, and then to choose not to, despite every indication suggesting that the time had come, required a level of trust and faith that transcended mere loyalty. And that trust was vindicated. The Emperor returned from his confrontation with Horus, carried by Rogel Dawn and Constantine Valdor and other loyal defenders, his body broken, but his soul intact. Horus was dead, slain by the Emperor's final terrible blow, and the siege was broken. The traitor forces, leaderless and demoralized by their leader's death, began to retreat from Terra, while pursued by furious loyalist forces who showed no mercy to those who had brought such devastation to humanity's homeworld. Vulkan witnessed the Emperor's placement upon the Golden Throne, saw the master of mankind sealed within the life support mechanisms that would sustain him for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor had won, but the victory had cost him everything. He would never walk among his people again, never lead the Imperium in person, never guide humanity toward the enlightened future he had envisioned. He would be trapped forever in a half-life, neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by daily sacrifices of psychers and by the desperate prayers of billions who did not fully understand what he had become. For Vulkan, the sight of the Emperor enthroned was both relief and tragedy. It was relief that he had not been required to activate the talisman, that Terra and its billions of inhabitants had been spared, but tragedy because the Emperor's dream, the vision of a unified and enlightened humanity spreading across the stars, had died, even as its architect survived. The Imperium that would emerge from the heresy would be a pale shadow of what had been intended, a repressive regime focused on survival rather than advancement, on dogma rather than enlightenment. And Vulkan had helped ensure that survival had stood ready to make the ultimate sacrifice to preserve even this diminished version of the dream. In the aftermath of the Emperor's entombment, Vulkan led a furious counterattack from the throne room itself. His rage at what had been done to the Emperor, his grief over the losses sustained during the siege, yet his relief at no longer having to carry the burden of the talisman, all of these emotions combined into a terrible fury. He fought his way through the retreating traitor forces, wielding Udrakale with devastating effect, showing no mercy to those who had brought such suffering to Terra. It was perhaps the most aggressive and violent campaign Vulkan had ever conducted, driven by emotions that he had suppressed during his long vigil in the throne room. This campaign saw Vulkan pursuing traitor forces across Terra and even into the outer system, determined to ensure that none of those who had participated in the siege would escape justice. His salamanders, those who had survived both the drop site massacre and the siege, fought alongside him with equal fury, avenging their fallen brothers and defending the Imperium that their Primarch had very nearly been required to destroy. The Great Scouring, as this period of counterattack came to be known, lasted for years and saw the loyalist forces pushing the traitors back into the Eye of Terror, that wound in reality where chaos held absolute dominion. During the Great Scouring, Vulkan's fury reached its peak when he learned of the atrocities the Emperor's children had committed on Terra during the siege. This particular traitor legion, led by Fulgrim, who had fallen to Slanesh, had not simply killed defenders, but had engaged in acts of such depravity that even describing them seemed to taint the speaker. Vulkan became obsessed with finding and killing Fabius Bile, the Emperor's children's chief apothecary, who was responsible for some of the worst experiments and tortures inflicted on captured loyalists. This hunt would consume him for months, taking him to worlds where the Emperor's children had left their marks, and witnessing scenes that reinforced his conviction that chaos represented an evil that could never be redeemed or reasoned with. But even in the midst of this righteous fury, Vulkan never forgot his principles. He still insisted that his forces avoid unnecessary civilian casualties, still took pains to protect innocent populations, even when pursuing traitor forces through inhabited areas. The compassion that Kurzi had tried to torture out of him, that the Emperor had exploited to make him guardian of the talisman, remained central to who he was. He was capable of terrible violence when necessary. He could fight with a fury that matched any of his brothers, but that violence was always bounded by consideration for those who deserved protection. The Vanishing. Mystery and Legend. Following the Great Scouring and the reformation of the imperial military structure, Vulkan faced a new challenge that in some ways proved more difficult than any battle he had fought. Robert Guilliman, taking charge of the shattered Imperium in the Emperor's absence, proposed the Codex Astartes, a comprehensive reorganization of the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters. The logic behind this reform was sound. The traitor legions had demonstrated how dangerous unified forces of such size could be if they turned against the Imperium. By breaking the legions into multiple smaller chapters, Morgilliman hoped to ensure that no future rebellion could field the overwhelming force that Horus had brought against Terra. Vulkan understood Guilliman's reasoning, but he opposed the Codex nonetheless. His opposition was not born of pride or desire to maintain his own power, as some of the other Primarch's objections were. Rather, Vulkan recognized that the Salamanders had suffered so terribly at Istvan V that they were already reduced to a fraction of their former strength. Breaking them into multiple chapters would further dilute their numbers and potentially weaken the strong cultural identity that had kept them loyal through the worst of the heresy. The values he had instilled in his legion, the emphasis on compassion and protection of civilians, might be lost if the Salamanders were scattered across multiple independent chapters. Moreover, Vulkan questioned whether Guilliman's reforms addressed the real problem. The traitor legions had not turned because they were too large or too unified. They had turned because their Primarchs had fallen to chaos or had embraced philosophies incompatible with the Emperor's vision. Simply making the legions smaller would not prevent future betrayals if the underlying causes of corruption were not addressed. But Vulkan's concerns were ultimately overruled, and the Salamanders, like most other legions, were broken into multiple chapters during what became known as the Second Founding. This period of reorganization and rebuilding was when Vulkan made a decision that would shape the next 10,000 years of his legion's history. He gathered his remaining Genesons and told them that he would be leaving them, following the example of Lehman Russ and other Primarchs who had stated they would return in the Imperium's darkest hour. But unlike some of his brothers, whose departures seemed impulsive or driven by grief and anger, Vulkan's departure was carefully planned and purposeful. He was not fleeing the Imperium or abandoning his sons. Instead, he was preparing for a future need that he could sense approaching, a time when the Imperium would require his presence again. Before his departure, Vulkan did something that would become central to his legion's culture and purpose. He took the 9 artifacts that had survived his earlier decision to destroy his vault, the items that Tekel had selected for preservation, and he scattered them across the galaxy. Some he left in obvious locations where they would eventually be found, and others he hid with such care that discovering them would require dedication and skill equal to their crafting. These artifacts would serve as both test and promise. If his salamanders could prove themselves worthy by recovering all 9 items, then Vulkan himself would return to lead them once more. More than a simple treasure hunt, the quest for the artifacts was meant to keep the salamanders focused on the principles Vulkan had taught them. Each artifact represented some aspect of his philosophy. The spear of Vulkan embodied the need for precise, focused force. The chalice of fire represented the value of creation and craftsmanship. Kesare's mantle symbolized protection and endurance. By seeking these items, the salamanders would be constantly reminded of what their Primarch had stood for, would maintain their connection to his teachings, even in his physical absence. The artifacts were not simply powerful weapons, though they were certainly that. They were physical embodiments of an ideology, tools for war that carried with them lessons about why war was sometimes necessary but never desirable. Vulkan also established the position of Forge Father, a title to be held by a captain who would renounce his name and take on Vulkan's identity in service of the quest. The Forge Father would dedicate his entire existence to searching for the artifacts, following clues left in the Tome of Fire, a compendium of knowledge and cryptic messages that Vulkan had prepared for this purpose. This role was not meant as punishment or exile, but as a sacred duty, the highest honor the salamanders could bestow upon one of their own. And the Forge Father would carry 3 of the artifacts, those that had been recovered, and would use them in his quest to find the others, serving as a living reminder that the search was ongoing and that Vulkan's eventual return remained possible. With these arrangements made, Vulkan departed from the Salamanders and from Terra, vanishing into the galaxy without explanation of where he was going or what he intended to do. Some of his sons believed he had gone seeking penance for the atrocities of the heresy. Others thought he was searching for lost artifacts or technology that could help the Imperium. A few suspected that he intended to hunt remaining traitors who had escaped the Great Scouring, to ensure that the enemies of humanity paid for their crimes. The truth, as was so often the case with the Primarchs, it was likely more complex and more private than any of these theories suggested. For 1,500 years, Vulkan walked the galaxy alone, a ghost haunting the edges of the Imperium he had helped create. Occasionally there were sightings, reports of a massive warrior matching his description appearing in places of great need, battling impossible odds, and then vanishing before proper identification could be made. Sometimes he was seen defending backwater worlds from Xenos raiders. Other times he appeared in the midst of civil conflicts where the Imperium's forces were struggling against rebellion or heresy. These sightings were rare enough to be dismissed as legend or misidentification, but common enough to suggest that wherever Vulkan had gone, he had not abandoned his duty to protect humanity, whilst the Salamanders maintained their faith that their Primarch would return. This belief became central to their identity as a chapter, shaping their culture and informing their decisions in ways both subtle and profound. Unlike some other chapters who viewed their Primarchs as distant historical figures or even myth, the Salamanders spoke of Vulkan as though he were merely away on an extended campaign, due to return at any moment. This expectation of return kept his teachings fresh and relevant, made his example an immediate concern rather than ancient history. When a Salamander made a decision about how to prosecute a campaign, or whether to prioritize civilian protection over tactical advantage, they did so knowing that Vulkan might one day return and judge whether they had remained true to his principles. As the quest for the artifacts became a defining feature of Salamander culture, each Forgefather who took up the quest knew that he was unlikely to recover all 9 artifacts during his lifetime, that he might spend decades or even centuries searching without finding a single one. Yet they accepted this burden willingly, viewing it not as futile labor, but as a sacred trust. The search took them across the galaxy, into regions controlled by enemy forces, to dead worlds where terrible secrets lay buried, through dangers that would have broken lesser warriors. Some Forgefathers died in their quest, their bodies never recovered, their achievements unknown to anyone but the Emperor himself. Others made spectacular discoveries, recovering artifacts that had been lost for millennia and bringing them home to Nocturne in triumph. Thus, by the 41st millennium, 5 of the 9 artifacts had been recovered. The Chalice of Fire, a massive forge ship capable of producing weapons of master-crafted quality, served as both relic and functional resource, its manufactorums providing the Salamanders with equipment superior to what most chapters could field. The Eye of Vulkan, a devastating orbital laser weapon, had been mounted as a defensive installation above Prometheus, Nocturne's moon, where it could protect the Salamander's homeworld from orbital attack. The Spear of Vulkan, Kazare's mantle, and the Gauntlet of the Forge were carried by the current Forgefather, Vulkan Hasten, who used them in his ongoing quest for the remaining 4 artifacts. The 4 missing artifacts remain sources of speculation and legend. The Unbound Flame, the Engine of Woes, the Obsidian Chariot, and the Song of Entropy were known only by name, their forms and functions mysteries that the Tome of Fire hinted at, but never explicitly revealed. Some Salamanders believed that these artifacts were not physical objects at all, but metaphorical concepts that would only become clear when the proper time came. Others insisted they were weapons or tools of such power that Vulkan had hidden them where only the most worthy could find them, in places so dangerous that the journey itself would prove whether the Salamanders deserved to wield what they discovered. This ongoing quest, this constant search for their Primarch's legacy, and the promise of his return gave the salamanders a sense of purpose that sustained them through 10,000 years of continuous warfare. While other chapters might have become cynical or jaded, or might have lost sight of why they fought beyond simple duty and tradition, the salamanders maintained their connection to their original purpose. They were not simply warriors of the Emperor, they were Vulkan's sons, inheritors of his compassion and his dedication to protecting humanity. And they believed, with a faith that bordered on religious conviction, that one day he would return to lead them once more. War without end, the beast arises. The return that the salamanders had waited for finally came, though not in the manner they had expected. In the 32nd millennium, approximately 1,500 years after Vulkan's departure, the Imperium faced what would become known as the War of the Beast, as a crisis of such magnitude that it threatened to accomplish what even Horus's rebellion had failed to achieve: the complete destruction of the Imperium itself. A green-skin warlord of unprecedented power, known simply as the Beast, had united the scattered Orc clans into a force that dwarfed any previous greenskin threat. This was not the usual chaotic tide of violence that characterized most Orc incursions, but a coordinated military campaign that demonstrated tactical sophistication and strategic planning far beyond what anyone believed Orcs capable of achieving. The Beast's forces were not simply numerous, though their numbers were staggering. They possessed technology that rivaled or even exceeded that of the Imperium in some areas, including the ability to construct attack moons, planetoid-sized battle stations that could destroy Imperial worlds with their weapons. The Orcs had developed a level of organization and discipline that seemed to contradict everything the Imperium thought it knew about greenskin nature. They struck at multiple targets simultaneously, coordinated their fleets across vast distances, and demonstrated a sophistication that suggested either the emergence of a new type of Orc evolution or the return of something ancient and terrible from before the Age of Strife. The Imperium's response to this threat was hampered by the same bureaucratic dysfunction and political infighting that had plagued it for centuries. The High Lords of Terror, more concerned with maintaining their own positions and privileges than with effectively coordinating the war effort, issued contradictory orders and allowed personal rivalries to undermine military operations. Fleet commanders waited for explicit authorization before taking action, even when delay meant losing critical opportunities to strike at Orc forces. The various branches of the Imperial military, from the Space Marines to the Imperial Guard to the Imperial Navy, operated independently rather than in coordination, each pursuing their own objectives without regard for the larger strategic picture. The result was a series of catastrophic defeats that brought the Orcs ever closer to terror itself. Imperial worlds fell like dominoes, their populations slaughtered or enslaved, their resources seized to fuel the Beast's war machine. Space Marine chapters were annihilated in futile last stands or desperate attempts to slow the Orc advance. The Imperium, which had grown complacent during centuries of relative peace following the Great Scouring, found itself unprepared for an enemy that combined the savage violence of greenskins with strategic acumen that matched or exceeded that of human commanders. As the situation grew increasingly desperate, an inquisitorial representative named Veritas brought crucial intelligence to Lord Commander Courland, one of the few Imperial commanders who had shown both competence and the willingness to make difficult decisions. Veritas revealed that Vulkan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, had been located. He was alive, fighting a one-man war on the world of Caldera, a planet under siege by the Beast's forces. The discovery of a living Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons who had not been seen in over a millennium, represented a potential turning point in the war. With a Primarch to rally around, the disparate Imperial forces might finally be unified under a single command. The political infighting might be set aside in favor of effective military action, and the Imperium might have a champion capable of facing the Beast in personal combat. Courland immediately organized an expedition to Caldera, gathering forces from multiple chapters, descended from the Imperial fists, as well as elements of the Imperial Guard and Navy. The journey to Caldera was itself perilous, requiring passage through Orc-controlled space and navigation around multiple attack fleets seeking to intercept Imperial ships. But the prize was worth the risk. If they could recruit Vulkan to their cause, if they could bring him back to Terra to lead the war effort, then perhaps the tide could be turned. The Imperium needed a hero, needed someone who could inspire hope in a population that had forgotten what victory looked like, needed a warrior whose prowess and presence could challenge the beast's dominance. What Courland found on Caldera both exceeded and fell short of his expectations. Vulkan was indeed present on the planet, fighting tirelessly against the Orc hordes that besieged it. He wielded a massive thunderhammer called Doom Tremor, a weapon he had forged himself after losing Dawnbringer during his earlier travels. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite being alone against millions of greenskins, Vulkan fought with an effectiveness that seemed superhuman even by Primarch standards. He appeared on battlefields across Caldera, rallying the planet's defenders, striking at critical targets in the Orc siege lines, and generally making himself such a persistent threat that the beast's forces were forced to divert significant resources to dealing with this single warrior. But Vulkan's mental state was concerning. The centuries of isolation, combined with the trauma he had never fully processed from his torture aboard the Nightfall and his experiences during the heresy, had left marks on his psyche. He was lucid and functional, capable of tactical thinking and strategic planning, but there was a distance to him, a sense that part of his consciousness remained somewhere else. He spoke of visions and omens, of sensing the beast's presence across vast distances of space, of knowing that this confrontation was destined and necessary. When Courland and his forces arrived on Caldera, and Vulkan recognized the opportunity they represented, but refused to leave with them immediately. The Primarch explained that he had sworn an oath long ago to the people of Caldera, promising them that he would never again allow their world to fall to devastation. This oath, made during some earlier visit whose details Vulkan did not elaborate upon, bound him to the planet's defense regardless of what might be happening elsewhere in the galaxy. He would not break his word, would not abandon Caldera's people to the Orcs, even if doing so meant refusing to lead the larger war effort. The only way Courland could recruit Vulkan was to first help save Caldera, to eliminate the Orc threat that had the planet on the verge of collapse. What followed was one of the most intense campaigns of the War of the Beast. Courland's forces, bolstered by Vulkan's personal leadership, mounted a desperate assault against the Orc siege positions surrounding Caldera's primary hive cities. The fighting was brutal and costly, with Space Marines dying by the hundreds and Imperial Guard regiments being ground away by the relentless Orc assaults. But Vulkan's presence made a difference that transcended simple combat effectiveness. The Imperial forces fought with a determination and coordination they had not previously shown, inspired by the knowledge that they fought alongside one of the Emperor's own sons. The people of Caldera, seeing that their legendary protector had brought reinforcements, found reserves of courage they had thought exhausted. The critical moment came when Vulkan led an assault against the construction generator powering an attack moon that was being built in orbit above Caldera. These attack moons were perhaps the beast's most devastating weapons, planet-killing stations that could reduce entire worlds to rubble. If the one above Caldera was completed, it would not only destroy the planet, but would then join the beast's fleet in attacking other Imperial worlds. Vulkan, recognizing that this threat needed to be eliminated regardless of the cost, personally led the assault team that would infiltrate the attack moon and destroy it from within. The battle inside the attack moon was fought in conditions that would have killed ordinary humans within seconds. The Orc construction was a nightmare of industrial violence, a massive machinery grinding away without safety measures or environmental controls, radiation leaking from poorly shielded reactors, gravity fluctuating wildly between different sections. Vulkan, and the Space Marines with him, fought through these hellish conditions against Orc defenders who seemed surprised that anything could have penetrated their defenses. The assault culminated in the generator chamber, where Vulkan personally destroyed the primary power source with Doom Tremor, the Thunderhammer's impact triggering a chain reaction that would eventually consume the entire attack moon. The evacuation from the doomed attack moon was a desperate race against the spreading explosions. Many of the Space Marines who had accompanied Vulkan did not make it out, as sacrificing themselves to cover the retreat of their brothers, or being caught by the cascading destruction before they could reach the extraction points. Vulkan himself was last to leave, ensuring that every other member of the assault team had escaped before he finally departed. As the attack moon tore itself apart, its destruction visible from Caldera's surface, the Orc forces besieging the planet faltered. The threat they had come to establish was gone, destroyed by the very forces they had been trying to eliminate. With Caldera saved and his oath fulfilled, Vulkan agreed to accompany Corland back to Terra. The journey home gave the Primarch time to learn about the state of the Imperium, and what he learned clearly disturbed him. The bureaucratic dysfunction, the political infighting, the willingness of supposedly loyal servants to prioritize their own power over the Imperium's survival. All of this represented a betrayal of everything the Emperor had tried to build. The Imperium Vulkan found in the 32nd Millennium was not the dream he had fought for during the Great Crusade, but a nightmare of oppression and stagnation held together more by inertia than by any genuine vision or purpose. When Vulkan arrived on Terra, he confronted the High Lords with a fury that shocked those who remembered him as the compassionate Primarch who valued life above all else. He castigated them for their failures, for the way their squabbling had allowed the beast to bring the Imperium to the brink of destruction. He spoke of the Emperor's vision, of the Imperium that was supposed to have been, and contrasted it with the rotting bureaucracy that actually existed. The High Lords, accustomed to being the highest authorities in the Imperium, found themselves subjected to a judgment from someone who had known the Emperor personally, who had fought at his side during the Great Crusade, and whose moral authority derived directly from being one of the master of mankind's own sons. But despite his anger and disappointment, Vulkan did not purge the High Lords or attempt to seize direct control of the Imperium. He recognized that such actions, however satisfying they might be in the short term, would cause more problems than they solved. The Imperium needed stability, needed continuity of governance, even if that governance was flawed. Revolution during a time of existential crisis would only hand victory to the beast. And so Vulkan offered the High Lords a deal. He would lead the military response to the beast, would take command of the forces being gathered for a massive counteroffensive, but the High Lords would stay in their positions and continue to manage the civilian infrastructure that kept the Imperium functioning. The force that assembled at Terra for the assault on Ullanor, the beast's homeworld, was the largest concentration of military power the Imperium had managed to gather since the Great Crusade. Multiple Space Marine chapters, including the Black Templars, Crimson Fists, Fists Exemplar, Excoriators, Iron Knights, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Dark Angels contributed forces. They were joined by massive contingents of Imperial Guard, significant elements of the Imperial Navy, and Mechanicum forces including Skitarii, Legio Cybernetica robots, Knights from House Taranis, and Titans from Legio Ultima. At the head of this vast armada stood Vulkan, the Primarch, who had returned from legend to lead humanity in its hour of need. Yet for all this martial power assembled under his nominal command, Vulkan remained strangely withdrawn during the journey to Ullanor. He sequestered himself in his quarters aboard the Fist's exemplar battle barge. Alcazar remembered, tinkering with Doom Tremor and refusing most attempts at communication. This behavior concerned many of the commanders, who had expected a Primarch to be actively involved in planning and coordinating the assault. But those few who were granted access to Vulkan during this time reported that he seemed to be preparing himself mentally for something, of focusing his will on a confrontation that he knew was coming. The assault on Ullanor revealed why the beast had been so successful. The planet itself had been transformed into an attack planet, the ultimate expression of Orc engineering and the psychic Gestalt power that greenskins could generate when properly organized. The entire world was a weapon, its surface covered with defensive installations and gun batteries that could target ships in orbit, its interior filled with vast manufactorums producing orc weapons and armor at a rate that seemed impossible. The city of Gorkogrod, where the beast maintained his seat of power, was larger than any human city had ever been, a sprawling metropolis of brutal architecture that housed millions of orcs and served as the coordinating center for the entire Greenskin Empire. The Imperial assault force, despite its size and power, found itself taking horrific casualties as it pushed toward Gorkogrod. The orcs fought with a discipline and tactical acumen that shocked veterans who had spent their lives battling greenskins. They used the urban environment to their advantage, funneling Imperial forces into kill zones where overlapping fields of fire could maximize casualties. Exotic orc weapons, some that manipulated gravity and others that drew on psychic power, wreaked havoc on Imperial formations. Massive orc gargants, walking war machines comparable to Imperial titans, engaged in devastating duels with the Mechanicum's own war engines. The fighting was so intense that casualty rates approached 50% in some Imperial Guard units, while 1 in 3 Space Marines was killed or wounded in the advance. Yet despite these terrible losses, the Imperial forces continued to push forward through sheer determination and the advantage of numbers. They could not be everywhere at once, but they could concentrate overwhelming force at critical points, breaking through orc defenses through attrition even when tactics failed. It was the kind of grinding, brutal warfare that the Imperium excelled at, the willingness to spend lives like currency to purchase victory, and eventually it brought the attackers to the walls of the beast's massive temple gargant, a structure so large that it could house armies within its walls, and so heavily armed that it could level entire city blocks with its weapons. It was here, at the threshold of the beast's sanctum, that Vulkan finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation. And he strode to the forefront of the Imperial forces, doom tremor in hand, and declared his intention to face the beast in single combat. The Primarch ordered a general evacuation of Imperial forces from the Temple Gargant, knowing that what was about to happen would be too dangerous for anyone else to witness. Corland, recognizing that he could do nothing against a foe that required a Primarch to confront, obeyed the order and withdrew his forces, though it pained him to leave Vulkan to face the beast alone. What transpired within the Temple Gargant has never been fully recorded, as there were no witnesses to survive and report what they saw. The sounds of battle that echoed from within the structure were audible across Gorkogrod, and the impacts of titanic blows shaking the ground and the roar of psychic energies causing reality itself to ripple. The duel between Vulkan and the beast was not simply a physical confrontation, but a clash of wills, of the Primarch's determination against the collective psychic might of the Orc Gestalt consciousness that the beast embodied. The battle raged for hours, the Temple Gargant's structure groaning and beginning to collapse as the two titans fought within it. Finally, there was a massive explosion that consumed the entire structure, a detonation so powerful that it created a mushroom cloud visible from orbit. The force of the blast leveled everything within kilometers, creating a crater where the beast's throne room had stood. When Imperial forces cautiously approached the ruins, once the radiation levels dropped to survivable ranges, they found no trace of either the beast or Vulkan. Both had vanished in the explosion, leaving only destruction in their wake. The loss of the beast and the apparent death of Vulkan marked the turning point of the war. Without their leader's coordinating presence and overwhelming psychic power, the Orc forces began to fragment and fight among themselves, reverting to the chaotic behavior that was their natural state. The Imperial forces, though battered and depleted, were able to exploit this division and eventually drive the remaining Orcs back from Imperial space. The war was won, but the cost had been staggering, and the Imperium that survived was weakened in ways that would take centuries to recover from. But the Salamanders refused to believe that their Primarch was truly dead. They had seen him survive too much, had faith in his perpetual nature and his promise to return. The fact that his body had not been found suggested to them that he had survived the confrontation with the beast and had once again departed on some mission known only to himself. They continued their quest for the artifacts, maintained their vigil on Nocturne, and kept their faith that one day Vulkan would return to lead them as he had during the War of the Beast. And perhaps they were right to maintain that faith, because for a being like Vulkan, death was never the ending it appeared to be. He had died hundreds of times before and had always returned. Why should this time be any different? Somewhere in the galaxy, and in some form that might be recognizable or might be something entirely new, Vulkan endured. He always had, and perhaps he always would, an eternal flame that no darkness could fully extinguish. Legacy of fire. Why Vulkan matters. In the 10,000 years since Vulkan's last confirmed sighting, the Imperium has changed in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to those who lived during the Great Crusade. The dream of enlightenment and unity that the Emperor championed has been replaced by a brutal theology that worships him as a god, despite his explicit rejection of such adoration. The scientific rationalism that was supposed to guide humanity's expansion has given way to superstition and ritual. The protection of human life, which was meant to be the central purpose of the Imperium's existence, has become secondary to the preservation of power structures and the maintenance of doctrinal purity. Yet in this dark age, where humanity faces extinction from 1,000 different threats, and where each day brings new horrors, the legacy of Vulkan endures through the actions of his gene-sons. The Salamanders chapter, along with their successor, chapters like the Black Dragons, Storm Giants, and others whose genetic lineage traces back to the Lord of Drakes, continue to embody the principles their Primarch taught them. They remain among the most humanitarian of all Space Marine chapters, still prioritizing the protection of civilians, even when doing so conflicts with tactical efficiency, still maintaining connections to the populations they defend, even when other chapters view baseline humans as beneath their notice. This adherence to Vulkan's teachings is not simply tradition or institutional inertia. The Salamanders actively choose to honor their Primarch's legacy because they recognize that his approach to warfare, though often dismissed as inefficient or naive, has produced results that vindicate his philosophy. Worlds that the Salamanders have defended remain loyal to the Imperium, not through fear, but through genuine gratitude and respect. Populations that have seen Salamanders fight and die to protect them become the Imperium's most dedicated supporters, willing to make sacrifices for a government that has demonstrated through actions rather than words that it values their lives. This loyalty, born of compassion rather than terror, has proven more enduring and more valuable than any number of forced compliance actions. The ongoing quest for Vulkan's artifacts has become a unifying purpose for the Salamanders and their successors. The current Forgefather, Vulkan Histan, carries 3 of the recovered artifacts and continues to search for the remaining 4. His quest has taken him across the galaxy, from the heart of Imperial space to regions bordering the Eye of Terror, from ancient tomb worlds to recently colonized frontier planets. He has fought Xenos and heretics, has delved into forgotten archives and explored ruins dating back to before the Age of Strife, all in pursuit of relics that represent his Primarch's legacy. But the quest is about more than simply recovering powerful weapons. Each artifact found reinforces the Salamander's connection to their Primarch and to the principles he embodied. The Spear of Vulkan, which burns with such heat that it can melt ceramite, serves as a reminder that even the most powerful force must be precisely directed to be truly effective. Kesari's mantle, the virtually impenetrable drake-scale cloak, symbolizes the protection that warriors owe to those they defend. The Gauntlet of the Forge, with its integrated heavy flamer, represents the dual nature of fire as both creator and destroyer, a force that must be wielded with wisdom and restraint. The Salamanders believe, with a faith that has not diminished across 10 millennia, that when all 9 artifacts are recovered, Vulkan will return to lead them once more. This belief shapes their entire culture and informs their long-term strategic planning in ways that might seem foolish to outsiders, but which have proven remarkably successful in practice. By maintaining hope for their Primarch's return, by believing that his absence is temporary rather than permanent, the Salamanders have kept his teachings alive and relevant in a way that few other chapters have managed with their own Primarch's legacies. The significance of this cannot be overstated. In the 41st millennium, most Space Marine chapters view their Primarchs as distant historical figures, legends whose example can be studied, but whose direct influence ended 10,000 years ago. The Salamanders, by contrast, speak of Vulkan as though he might return tomorrow, as though his judgment of their actions remains an immediate concern rather than an abstract theological question. This expectation of accountability keeps them honest in their adherence to his principles, or prevents the slow corruption of purpose that has afflicted so many other imperial institutions. They cannot simply pay lip service to Vulkan's teachings while ignoring them in practice, because they believe he will one day return and see firsthand how well they maintained his legacy. This brings us to the central question. Why does Vulkan matter? Why should he be remembered not just as another Primarch among 18, but as perhaps the most important of the Emperor's sons, despite his relative lack of fame or glory compared to figures like Horus, Guilliman, or Sanguinius? The answer lies in understanding what Vulkan represented and what the Imperium lost when it failed to fully embrace his philosophy. Vulkan understood something fundamental that many of his brothers never grasped, that the purpose of power is protection, not domination. He recognized that the Imperium's strength should be measured not by how many worlds it could conquer or how many enemies it could destroy, but by how many innocent lives it could preserve and elevate. This was not weakness disguised as strength, but actual strength, expressed through restraint and wisdom. It took far more courage to risk oneself to protect others than to simply annihilate threats regardless of collateral damage. It required far more skill to achieve victory while minimizing casualties than to pursue victory at any cost. His brothers, by contrast, often fell into the trap of viewing strength primarily as the capacity for violence. Ferrus Manus valued the perfection of the warrior, but his pride in that perfection contributed to his death at Istvan V when he refused to retreat from an unwinnable position. Perturabo could design fortifications and conduct sieges with unmatched skill, but his willingness to sacrifice his own sons casually bred resentment that contributed to his fall to chaos. Mortarian's endurance and resilience were legendary, but they were expressed through the infliction and endurance of suffering rather than through the preservation of life. Even Sanguinius, often held up as the noblest of the Primarchs, fought primarily for ideals and abstractions rather than for the concrete well-being of specific individuals. Vulkan was different. He fought for individuals, for the farmer whose fields he helped defend, for the craftsman whose forge he visited, for the child whose future he secured by standing against the darkness. His compassion was not abstract or philosophical, but practical and immediate. And this made him far more dangerous to the Imperium's enemies than any amount of tactical genius or strategic brilliance alone could have achieved. Because Vulkan was not simply trying to win battles, he was building a civilization worth defending, creating the very thing that gave all the fighting meaning and purpose. The tragedy is that the Imperium never fully embraced this approach. Vulkan's methods were respected within his own legion, but dismissed as idiosyncratic by most others. The attitude prevailed that compassion was acceptable as a personal preference, but could not be the foundation of military doctrine or strategic policy. The result was an Imperium that became increasingly brutal and oppressive, that treated human life as expendable in the pursuit of abstract goals. And that lost sight of why it was fighting in the obsessive focus on how to fight most effectively. And this is why Vulkan is underestimated, because the conventional metrics by which Primarchs are evaluated, number of worlds brought to compliance, battlefield victories achieved, tactical innovations developed, systematically undervalue what Vulkan actually accomplished. His true achievement was not in the battles he won, but in the legacy he created. Not in the enemies he destroyed, but in the principles he upheld, even when doing so was costly or difficult. He proved that it was possible to be both compassionate and effective, both protective and powerful, both human and transhuman. The possibility of his return, which the salamanders maintain, is not mere possibility but eventual certainty. It represents hope for the Imperium in ways that go beyond simple military might. If Vulkan does return, he would bring with him a living memory of what the Imperium was supposed to be, a reminder that the Emperor's vision was not simply conquest and domination, but the elevation and protection of all humanity. His presence could serve as a moral anchor for an Imperium that has lost its moral compass, could demonstrate through example that the brutal necessities of survival do not require abandoning all compassion or humanity. In recent developments, with the Great Rift tearing the galaxy in half and the return of Reboot Guilliman to lead the Imperium once more, the possibility of Vulkan's return seems more plausible than it has in millennia. The Salamanders and their successor chapters have intensified their search for the remaining artifacts, with multiple chapters contributing forces to the quest for the first time in their history. The Covenant of Fire and Hammers of Nocturne have deployed entire companies to aid in the search, while other successor chapters have sent smaller but equally dedicated contingents. This unprecedented cooperation suggests that the Salamanders sense that the time for Vulkan's return is approaching, that the darkest hour he spoke of is finally at hand. And perhaps they are right. The Imperium faces threats on a scale not seen since the heresy itself. The forces of chaos surge through the Great Rift. Demons walk openly on worlds that were once considered secure. Entire sectors have fallen to darkness. The Tyrannid hive fleets consume world after world, leaving nothing but lifeless rocks in their wake. The Necrons awaken from their ancient slumber, wielding technology that makes even the Imperium's most advanced weapons seem primitive. The Orcs mass, in numbers that recall the War of the Beast, their tribal conflicts giving way to organized campaigns under powerful war bosses, and countless lesser threats, from heretical cults to Xenos raiders to simple human corruption and decay, erode the Imperium from within, even as it battles enemies without. In such an age, the return of a Primarch who understands that the purpose of all this fighting is to protect something worth preserving might be exactly what the Imperium needs. Vulkan would not solve all problems through his presence alone. He is not a miracle worker or a god, despite what some might believe. But he would represent a different approach to the Imperium's challenges, a reminder that survival without humanity is not truly survival at all, but simply a prolonged death. His voice, speaking with the authority of one who knew the Emperor personally and who embodied the best aspects of what the Primarchs were meant to be, might finally force the Imperium to confront uncomfortable truths about what it has become and what it needs to change if it is to have any future worth fighting for. So when we ask why Vulkan is the most underestimated Primarch, the answer becomes clear. He is underestimated because his greatest strengths were not the kind that show up in casualty reports or conquest statistics. He is underestimated because compassion is often mistaken for weakness by those who value only the capacity for violence. He is underestimated because he succeeded not through flashy demonstrations of power, but through the patient, consistent application of principles that take time to show results. And he is underestimated because the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to convince itself that his approach was unnecessary, that brutal efficiency is all that matters, that compassion is a luxury humanity cannot afford. But the Salamanders know better. They have maintained their Primarch's legacy across 10 millennia of darkness, have kept his flame burning when it would have been easier to let it go out. They have proven through their actions that Vulkan's approach works, that it produces not just military victories, but genuine loyalty and lasting peace. And they wait, with a patience their Primarch would be proud of, for the day when he returns and shows the Imperium what it has been missing all along. Whether that return will come through the recovery of all 9 artifacts, through some cosmic alignment of circumstances, or through means entirely unexpected, the Salamanders cannot say. But they believe, and their belief itself is a form of resistance against the darkness that threatens to consume everything. In an age where hope is rare and faith often misplaced, the Salamander's conviction that their Primarch lives and will return represents something precious and powerful. Because Vulkan was never just a warrior or a craftsman or a leader, though he was all of these things and more, he was. It's fundamentally a guardian, a being who understood that true strength lies in protection rather than destruction, that wisdom sometimes requires restraint rather than action, and that the measure of one's character is found not in moments of triumph, but in how one responds to impossible choices and terrible losses. He was tested in ways that few of his brothers experienced, subjected to torments that would have broken lesser beings, forced to make decisions that had no good answers. And through it all, he remained true to himself and to the principles that Enbel had taught him in a forge on a volcanic world that seemed to exist in a different lifetime. That is why Vulkan matters. Not because he was the strongest Primarch, though his perpetual nature made him uniquely resilient. Not because he was the most successful military commander, but though his campaigns were generally effective and well executed, but because he represented what the Imperium could have been if it had chosen a different path, if it had valued compassion alongside strength, if it had remembered that the purpose of all the fighting was to protect and preserve, rather than simply to conquer and control. And that is why, when the final accounting is made, and the history of the Imperium is written with the perspective that only the end of ages can provide, Vulkan may be remembered as the most important of all the Primarchs. Not the most famous or the most celebrated, but the most important. Because he showed that another way was possible, that strength and compassion were not mutually exclusive, that humanity could survive without sacrificing its humanity. And in an age of darkness that seems without end, that message, that hope, that living embodiment of an alternative path may be exactly what saves us all. If you found this exploration of Vulkan's story compelling, if you're now viewing this underestimated Primarch in a new light, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into Warhammer 40k lore. The flames of knowledge burn brightest when shared, and your support helps keep that flame alive. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is always hope, even if we have to create it ourselves through the choices we make and the principles we refuse to abandon. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Vulkan's legend, and may you carry forward his lessons about the importance of compassion, the value of creation, and the understanding that true strength lies not in the capacity to destroy, but in the wisdom to protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.